Help me, please. October rain hammered Seattle's Capitol Hill like bullets of liquid desperation, each drop carrying the weight of choices made in darkness and consequences delivered in neon-soaked light. Through the fractured windshield of his 10-year-old Honda Civic, Ryan Carter watched the woman who had obliterated his carefully constructed life stumble into the kind of trouble that left permanent scars on both body and soul. Jessica Walsh, Chief Executive Officer of Walsh Marketing Solutions, architect of his professional extinction. The reason his 7-year-old daughter now asked why their new cereal tasted like cardboard swayed on Louboutin heels that had no business navigating rain-slicked asphalt outside Mickey's Tavern at 2:17 in the morning. 3 men circled her like urban predators, sensing weakness in expensive packaging. Their laughter cut through the storm's white noise, sharp as glass breaking against concrete. Hungry in the way that made decent people cross streets and lock car doors and pretend they hadn't seen what couldn't be unseen. Ryan's iPhone buzzed against the passenger seat, a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Help me, please." Below the desperate words, a location pin pointed exactly where he sat. Idling in the rideshare pickup zone, engine running, watching his former boss discover that money couldn't purchase safety when you were drunk and outnumbered in the kind of neighborhood where Seattle's polished downtown facade cracked to reveal the teeth underneath. The phone's screen illuminated his dashboard, casting blue light across calloused fingers that had once typed quarterly projections and client proposals, but now gripped steering wheels for strangers who paid $3 a mile to avoid driving themselves through the city's liquid maze. 6 months of night shifts had carved permanent exhaustion into the lines around his eyes, had taught him the geography of desperation that existed between the skyscrapers where people like Jessica Walsh made decisions and the apartments where people like him lived with the consequences. He should accelerate past this moment, merge into Aurora Avenue traffic, pretend the text had reached someone else's phone. Every logical neuron fired reasons she had terminated his employment without explanation had forced him to explain to Lily why they'd moved from their Ballard craftsman to a Greenwood apartment where Mrs. Chen's Mandarin soap operas provided their evening soundtrack through walls thin as dignity. But his daughter's voice whispered through the Honda's recycled air, clear as Sunday morning church bells. "We help people, Daddy. Not because they deserve it, but because we do." Those words had been born from a conversation 3 weeks ago, when Lily had returned from Broadview Elementary with tear streaks on her cheeks and a question that could break a father's heart. "Why should I share my art supplies with Emma when she calls my lunch?" Poor kid food. Ryan had knelt to her level in their cramped kitchen, the one where they counted grocery coupons like rosary beads, and held her paint-stained fingers in his rougher ones. "Because that's who we choose to be, sweetheart. We help people not because they've earned it, but because helping is what makes us human." She had processed this with the gravity of a small philosopher, weighing universal truths. Even when they're mean, especially then, because showing kindness when it's difficult is what makes it count. The next day, Lily had shared her 64-count Crayola box with Emma Richardson had come home with stories of collaborative artwork and a friendship forged from crayons and forgiveness. "You were right, Daddy," she'd announced over their dinner of boxed macaroni and hope. "Being nice when someone's mean is super hard, but it makes your chest feel warm after." Now Ryan sat in October rain, watching Jessica Walsh learn what powerlessness tasted like, and his daughter's wisdom echoed in the space between his anger and his conscience. Through the windshield, one predator grabbed Jessica's wrist. She twisted away her Hermes coat, sliding off one shoulder to reveal silk that cost more than Ryan's monthly rent. Her mouth moved, probably forming the word no, probably discovering that wealth only worked when circumstances allowed negotiation. Ryan's mind flashed to that February Thursday when his professional life had detonated in a corner office overlooking Elliott Bay. Jessica's voice arctic as Puget Sound in winter. "We're letting you go, Ryan. Effective immediately. No explanation, no apology. No recognition that spreadsheet entries represented mortgage payments and children's dreams and the careful architecture adults built to protect the people they loved." That afternoon, he'd carried 3 years of accumulated purpose in a cardboard box, while former colleagues studied their monitors with the intensity of people desperately avoiding eye contact with professional mortality made visible. The security guard kind-faced Martin, who'd nodded hello each morning for 36 months, had offered the only sympathy. "Take care of yourself, son." The memory tasted like betrayal seasoned with desperation. But underneath it, Lily's voice persisted. "We help people, Daddy?" His phone buzzed again. Same message, same location pin, same plea from a woman who'd never pleaded for anything in her corporate structured existence. The tallest predator had Jessica's other arm now. She pulled backward heels scraping concrete, like fingernails on chalkboard, the sound cutting through 6 months of carefully buried rage. They were enjoying this, the fear in her eyes, the way money meant nothing when you were alone and scared, and running out of options faster than battery life on a phone that might be your only lifeline. Ryan closed his eyes and heard his daughter reading bedtime stories to her stuffed elephant. Her voice serious as scripture, and the little mouse helped the big lion, even though the lion had been mean, because good hearts don't keep score. Lily believed in him with the unwavering faith that 7-year-olds reserved for fathers who tucked them in and made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, and promised that everything would work out even when everything demonstrably wouldn't. What would that faith be worth if he chose vengeance over virtue, when virtue cost him everything and gave him nothing except the knowledge that he'd been better than his circumstances? The phone buzzed a 3rd time. Same desperate prayer from a woman learning that desperation was democratic, that it visited corner offices and alleyways with equal enthusiasm, that sometimes the people you'd wronged were the only ones close enough to save you. Ryan took a breath that tasted like rain and responsibility, like October air seasoned with his daughter's unconditional trust. He thought about the kind of world he wanted Lily to inherit, one where strangers helped each other, where mercy was stronger than memory, where fathers proved themselves worthy of the faith placed in purple crayon love notes that decorated lunchboxes like daily blessings. The predators moved closer. Jessica stumbled backward, and Ryan Carter, former marketing coordinator, current rideshare driver, permanent guardian of a 7-year-old's belief in human goodness, opened his car door and stepped into the rain. 6 months earlier, steam still rose from Ryan's favorite mug, the ceramic masterpiece Lily had painted in kindergarten, complete with asymmetrical hearts and world's best daddy rendered in cobalt blue that had somehow survived both kiln firing and a 7-year-old's artistic enthusiasm when Margaret from HR materialized beside his cubicle like bad news wearing business casual. "Ryan, Ms. Walsh would like to see you in her office." The words drifted across Walsh Marketing Solutions' open-plan workspace with the deceptive casualness of autumn leaves that presaged winter's destruction. Around him, colleagues performed the universal dance of corporate voyeurism. Quick glances followed by sudden fascination with monitor screens, the office equivalent of slowing down to observe accident scenes while pretending you weren't calculating the severity of damage. Ryan saved his work on the Emerald City Restaurant Group campaign, 37 locally owned establishments finally ready to embrace digital marketing after 3 months of patient relationship building, and stood on legs that had suddenly developed the structural integrity of overcooked spaghetti. His coffee remained untouched, steam dissipating like his sense of Thursday morning normalcy. The trek to Jessica's corner office required navigation through Walsh Marketing's deliberately inspirational landscape. Motivational posters declaring "innovation through collaboration," and "your limitation is your imagination," phrases that would soon taste like irony, dissolved in pink slip solution. Past the break room where he'd celebrated his Seafair Marketing Award 9 months ago, past Conference Room B where he'd pitched the Pike Place Market Vendor Collective campaign that had netted the firm its first 6-figure food service contract. 26 steps from his desk to destiny. He counted them involuntarily, his mind seeking quantifiable anchors in a moment that felt like falling through space without reference points. Jessica's office commanded the building's northwest corner floor-to-ceiling windows, framing a view of Elliott Bay that probably cost more in annual rent than Ryan's Ballard mortgage. She sat behind a desk carved from what appeared to be a single piece of Brazilian mahogany, her platinum hair sculpted into the kind of precision bob that required weekly appointments and quarterly touch-ups. Her grey eyes focused on a manila folder with the concentration of someone reading either state secrets or termination paperwork. "Sit down, Ryan." The leather chair exhaled expensive air as he settled into it, the sound reminiscent of wealth, whispering secrets to those temporarily permitted to witness its magnificence. Behind Jessica, tugboats pushed container ships across water that reflected February clouds like metallic scales, and somewhere beyond the harbor, Mount Rainier brooded beneath snow that would outlast most human ambitions. Jessica hadn't acknowledged his presence with eye contact, a tactical choice that suggested this conversation would proceed according to corporate script rather than human decency. She turned a page in the manila folder, manicured nails tapping against mahogany in rhythm that sounded like countdown numbers falling toward 0. "We're letting you go, Ryan. Effective immediately." The sentence landed like a physical blow, knocking comprehension sideways and leaving his nervous system scrambling to process information that couldn't possibly be accurate. Not "we need to discuss your performance or budget constraints, require difficult decisions, or even you screwed up the Henderson account." Just clinical termination delivered with the emotional warmth of automated phone systems announcing service disconnections. Ryan's mouth opened, but sound refused to cooperate. The office air had become unbreathable oxygen replaced by the suffocating realization that stable employment was apparently subject to cancellation without advance notice or rational explanation. "I don't understand." His voice emerged foreign to his own ears, pitched higher than normal by confusion, metabolizing into panic. "Did I miss something?" "The Emerald City campaign is ahead of schedule. The Pike Place vendors have increased foot traffic by 37%. And I just brought in the—" "This isn't performance-related." Jessica's tone carried the warmth of medical equipment announcing terminal diagnoses. She finally looked up, making eye contact for exactly 3 seconds before her gaze skittered away like water off treated fabric. "Budget restructuring. Corporate directive. But I've been here almost 4 years. I won the Regional Seafair Award. My client retention rate is 93%, which is—" "The decision is final, Ryan." She stood smoothing her charcoal skirt with the finality of someone closing books on chapters she'd never bothered to read completely. Behind her, the Seattle skyline continued its indifferent rotation. Pike Place market vendors selling flowers to tourists who believed in happy endings, ferries carrying commuters who still possessed jobs to commute toward. HR will process your final paycheck. Security will escort you to collect personal items. Ryan remained seated, temporarily paralyzed by the cognitive dissonance of successful employees being terminated without cause of 3 years and 11 months of dedicated service being reduced to collect personal items. The folder on Jessica's desk looked thin for something that contained his professional death warrant, probably containing nothing more substantive than legal boilerplate and his signature from employment documents he'd signed when optimism was still affordable. Why me? The question emerged smaller than he'd intended, carrying the bewilderment of someone discovering that competence was apparently insufficient protection against arbitrary corporate decisions. Jessica closed the folder, stood straighter, adjusted her blazer in the universal gesture of conversations being terminated regardless of participant readiness. These decisions are never easy, Ryan. I'm sorry. But her vocal inflection suggested they were actually quite easy efficient as quarterly profit calculations, and considerably less complicated than finding creative alternatives to human resource reduction. Martin appeared in the doorway, the security guard, whose daughter attended Broadview Elementary with Lily, who'd shared kindergarten graduation photos and compared notes about the inexplicable mathematics homework requirements imposed on 6-year-olds. His expression carried genuine sympathy wrapped in professional obligation. "Take your time, son. We'll wait in the hall." The return journey to his desk felt longer than the initial 26 steps, as if distance expanded proportionally to the magnitude of life changes being processed in real time. His colleagues had developed sudden fascination with quarterly reports and client communications conversations dying mid-sentence as he passed the break room. Emptying with the efficiency of people avoiding contagion they couldn't understand but instinctively feared. Ryan's cubicle looked identical to how he'd left it 20 minutes ago, but everything felt different. The Seahawks calendar, the photo of him and Lily at Alki Beach last summer, both grinning with sand in their hair and joy in their eyes, the small, succulent Lily had given him for his birthday because plants make sad offices happy daddy. 3 years and 11 months of professional identity fit into a cardboard box. Martin provided coffee mug, family photo award plaque, plant, and the accumulated detritus of someone who'd believed that showing up early and staying late mattered to people who measured human value in spreadsheet entries. The elevator descent felt endless. Ryan studied his reflection in polished steel doors and saw a stranger 38 years old wearing a tie that suddenly felt like a noose holding a box, like a beggar carrying his entire kingdom. In the lobby, the receptionist offered a sympathetic smile. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Carter." Outside, February air bit exposed skin with the enthusiasm of winter refusing to acknowledge spring's eventual arrival. Commuters hurried past on sidewalks leading to offices where they still possessed purpose, still commanded respect, still drew paychecks that covered mortgages and children's dreams and the careful architecture adults built to protect people they loved more than themselves. Ryan stood holding his cardboard box and watching the world continue rotating as if his personal apocalypse was just another Thursday morning requiring no special consideration from the universe. The drive home passed in a blur of traffic lights and radio songs that seemed designed to mock his circumstances. He pulled into the driveway of their Ballard Craftsman, the house he'd been planning to refinance once his next promotion came through. The place where Lily learned to ride bicycles and planted marigolds and believed her father could fix anything that broke. Inside, his daughter sat at the kitchen table, blonde head bent over math homework that spread across the surface like evidence of educational dedication. She looked up when the front door closed. Green eyes, his eyes taking in the cardboard box with the terrible wisdom children developed when life taught them more than textbooks ever could. "Why did she fire you?" "Daddy." And Ryan knelt beside her chair, set the box containing his former professional identity on linoleum they'd been planning to replace with hardwood, and tried to find words that would explain how sometimes the world broke good things simply because it could. The apartment on Greenwood Avenue smelled like other people's cooking and carried the acoustics of dreams downsized to fit smaller budgets. Ryan had signed the lease 3 weeks after receiving his final Walsh marketing paycheck, trading crown molding for ceiling stains garden views for parking lot perspectives and the illusion of upward mobility for the reality of lateral survival. Mrs. Chen's evening Mandarin television programs provided their soundtrack through walls constructed with the structural integrity of good intentions and insufficient soundproofing. At precisely 7:30 each night, melodramatic dialogue from shows about star-crossed lovers and family honor would bleed through drywall, creating a bilingual atmosphere that Lily had declared like living in a multicultural movie, where we don't know the plot, but we can feel the emotions. Their second-floor unit overlooked the dumpster behind Golden Dragon Restaurant, where the aroma of ginger and garlic, mixed with urban decay, to create an olfactory symphony that reminded them daily of their new station in Seattle's economic hierarchy. But Lily had adapted with the resilience children possessed when their foundations shifted beneath them, declaring their 800-square-foot kingdom cozy like a bear den, but with better TV reception. Every evening before Ryan departed for his rideshare shift, Lily orchestrated lunch preparation with the gravity of someone entrusted with sacred ritual. Standing on her step-stool purchased at Goodwill for $3.99 and decorated with flower stickers she'd applied with mathematical precision, she wielded a butter knife like Excalibur, transforming peanut butter and jelly into geometric shapes that defied both gravity and culinary tradition. "Stars for good luck tonight," she announced, pressing cookie cutters through sandwich layers with the concentration of a surgeon performing microsurgery. "And hearts for love, and squares, because squares are honest shapes that don't try to be fancy when fancy isn't needed." Her philosophy of sandwich construction had evolved over 6 months of nightly preparations, each shape carrying specific intentions designed to fortify her father against the metropolitan wilderness, where strangers paid him $3 per mile to navigate their lives between destinations. Apple slices occupied the side compartment, precisely cut to avoid browning, accompanied by string cheese and juice boxes that cost 37 cents more than generic alternatives, but provided the psychological comfort of brand recognition in a world where most comforts had become unaffordable. And always inevitably, a note adhered to the lunchbox lid with tape dispenser precision. Tonight's message inscribed in purple crayon with the deliberate penmanship of someone who understood that words possessed power. "Drive safe, Daddy. You're my favorite person in the whole universe, including astronauts and people who invented ice cream." Ryan preserved every note in a shoebox beneath his bed. 57 manifestos of unconditional affection that served as documentary evidence that some forms of wealth couldn't be reduced to bank statements or credit scores. When despair threatened to overwhelm him during traffic jams or difficult passengers, or moments when his former life felt like mythology from someone else's biography, he would remember the shoebox containing daily proof that he remained someone's universe, someone's definition of heroic. "What's tonight's note say?" Lily asked, though she'd authored every word and could recite the contents verbatim. Ryan read aloud with the solemnity he'd once reserved for client presentations. "It says that I have the most thoughtful daughter in the Pacific Northwest, possibly the entire continent, and definitely the best lunch-making assistant in the history of peanut butter sandwich engineering." Lily giggled, the sound bright as newly minted coins tossed into fountains by people making wishes. "That's not what it says." "Are you absolutely certain? Because that's clearly what I'm reading here." This exchange had become liturgy, their pre-departure ritual that transformed Ryan's leaving from abandonment into adventure, from necessity into choice, made bearable by love offered without conditions or expectations. The rideshare staging lot resembled a support group for the economically reorganized drivers, in vehicles that told honest stories about resilience measured in miles per gallon rather than horsepower. Margaret occupied her usual position beside a Honda Odyssey, decorated with rosary beads and family photos, her thermos releasing coffee aromatics that suggested cinnamon and determination. David hunched over crossword puzzles in his 15-year-old Accord vocabulary exercises, providing mental stimulation during intervals between ride requests. There was Luis, 23 years old, and supporting both community college tuition and his mother's medical bills in El Salvador, his back seat packed with textbooks that transformed red lights into study opportunities. Sandra, former Northgate Elementary third-grade teacher, had been displaced when budget cuts prioritized administrative positions over classroom instruction. She kept children's drawings taped to her dashboard like talismans against cynicism. Each driver carried invisible cargo mortgage payments and prescription costs, and the accumulated weight of lives interrupted by economic forces beyond individual control. They shared practical intelligence about surge zones and difficult passengers, and which gas stations offered the best combination of price and bathroom cleanliness, creating informal community from shared necessity. Ryan's iPhone buzzed ride request from Capitol Hill to SeaTac Airport. 43 minutes if I-5 cooperated, which it rarely did during evening hours when Seattle's traffic transformed into automotive purgatory. He accepted the ride and navigated toward pickup coordinates, another evening of breathing strangers' exhaust and conversation. The passenger was a business traveler, expensive suit, cheaper cologne, the kind of aggressive phone conversation that suggested he considered rideshare vehicles to be mobile office space staffed by invisible chauffeurs. He spent the entire journey discussing quarterly projections with someone in another time zone, his voice carrying the confidence of someone whose professional security remained unquestioned. The Denver numbers look soft, but Portland's exceeding expectations by 12%, he announced to his phone, while Ryan maneuvered through traffic that moved like arthritis-made vehicular. We should consider reallocating resources from underperforming markets to areas showing organic growth potential. Listening to corporate strategy discussions, Ryan felt like a ghost haunting his former existence. This was the world he'd once inhabited: meetings and metrics, and the careful cultivation of relationships that translated into revenue. Now he was infrastructure, as forgettable as the seat the businessman occupied, as invisible as the car that delivered him to his destination. At SeaTac, the passenger left a $4 tip and exited without acknowledgement, wheeling his carry-on toward departure gates that led to cities where other people made decisions about resource allocation and market optimization. Ryan sat in the cell phone lot, watching planes carry travelers toward destinations he couldn't afford, and checked his phone for texts from Mrs. Chen. Lily finished homework at 6:45, brushed teeth without reminding, reading chapter book about horses. No problems tonight. Mrs. Chen had evolved into their guardian angel through proximity and shared understanding of single parenthood's logistics. The 74-year-old widow charged $25 per week to monitor Lily through walls thin as tissue paper, to be available for emergencies that couldn't wait for Ryan's return from earning the money that kept them housed and fed and marginally secure. Her carefully constructed English notes provided updates that had become essential communications. Lily coughed 4 times during homework. Maybe throat lozenges tomorrow, or bad dream at 8:30. Talked about mummy again. Needed extra hugs. The next ride took Ryan to a house party in Magnolia, where 3 University of Washington students discussed spring break plans that cost more than his monthly rent. They debated destination merits, Cabo, versus Cancun resort quality versus nightlife accessibility. While Ryan navigated residential streets lined with houses that suggested their parents' success in professions he'd once aspired toward. "My dad says experience is more valuable than money," announced one passenger, apparently unconscious of irony, while discussing expenditures that exceeded many families' annual vacation budgets. Back at the staging lot near midnight, Ryan tallied the evening's earnings, $127, before gas and vehicle maintenance, enough for 3 days of groceries, if he shopped with careful attention to unit pricing and generic alternatives. Enough for Lily's school lunch account through Friday. Enough to maintain their marginal foothold in Seattle's economy for another 24 hours. He drove home through streets that looked like movie sets after actors had departed past the Walsh Marketing Building, where security lights illuminated empty offices, and the Pike Place Market, where vendors would arrive at 5 a.m. to arrange flowers and fish, and the organic optimism that sustained people who believed tomorrow might offer improvements over today. At home, he climbed stairs that complained under his weight and unlocked their apartment door with keys that still felt temporary after 6 months. Inside, Lily slept peacefully in her bedroom arms, wrapped around the stuffed elephant that had accompanied her through every major life transition since toddlerhood. Ryan stood in her doorway, listening to breathing that sounded like contentment, despite circumstances that could have justified anxiety. On their kitchen table, she'd left another surprise, a drawing created with crayons purchased with coins discovered between couch cushions. Two stick figures held hands beneath a rainbow that arced over a house that looked nothing like their Greenwood apartment and everything like hope rendered in primary colors. At the bottom, in purple letters that would fade before her faith in him, did Daddy and Lily's Tomorrow House. Ryan taped it to their refrigerator beside 46 others, creating a gallery of optimism that had nothing to do with economic indicators and everything to do with 7-year-old certainty that love was more powerful than circumstances. Then he opened his laptop and resumed the job search that had become his second occupation, scrolling through opportunities that required qualifications he possessed, but references from positions that had ended without explanation. Tomorrow he would submit 5 more applications to companies that probably wouldn't respond, would drive strangers through a city that had once known his name, would pack another lunchbox with star-shaped sandwiches and love notes that kept him tethered to purpose beyond mere survival. Tonight, though, it was enough to be home to check on Lily one final time, to know she was safe and loved, and dreaming of tomorrow houses that existed somewhere beyond their current reality, but within the realm of possibility created by fathers who refused to surrender hope, even when hope required daily renovation. Outside, Mrs. Chen's television murmured Mandarin lullabies through walls that had become permeable boundaries between solitude and community, between individual struggle and collective resilience. Somewhere in the distance, another shift was ending. Another driver was counting tips and calculating whether dignity was worth the price of survival. Another parent was discovering that love multiplied rather than divided when you shared it with people brave enough to keep believing in better tomorrows. Ryan's iPhone vibrated against the Civic's passenger seat like an electronic heartbeat gone irregular, its screen illuminating the dashboard with blue light that competed with the red neon bleeding from Mickey's Tavern into October rain. The message appeared from an unknown number 10 digits that didn't exist in his contacts, carrying 2 words that would alter the trajectory of 4 lives forever. Help me, please. Below the desperate plea, a location pin pointed with GPS precision to the exact coordinates where he sat idling in the rideshare pickup zone, watching Jessica Walsh discover that corporate power dissolved like expensive mascara when you were drunk and outnumbered in Seattle's Capitol Hill after-hours ecosystem. The geographic coincidence felt orchestrated by a universe with a twisted sense of dramatic timing, as if fate had decided this confrontation was overdue and would be settled tonight in rain and neon and the space between mercy and revenge. Through his water-streaked windshield, Ryan observed the choreography of urban predation unfolding with inevitable precision. 3 men had positioned themselves around Jessica with the strategic spacing of wolves who understood pack hunting, their body language radiating the kind of casual menace that made decent people cross streets and avoid eye contact and pretend they hadn't witnessed what couldn't be unseen once observed. The tallest predator wore designer jeans that suggested trust fund confidence rather than earned wealth. His movements loose with alcohol and entitlement. His companions flanked Jessica like understudies in a play about masculine toxicity, their laughter cutting through storm noise with the sharp edges of glass fragments that drew blood before you realized you'd been cut. Jessica herself looked nothing like the untouchable executive who had terminated his employment without explanation 6 months ago. Her Hermes coat hung off one shoulder like expensive surrender, her normally pristine platinum bob disheveled by rain and whatever internal storm had driven her to seek oblivion in places where successful CEOs usually feared to venture. She swayed on designer heels that transformed navigating wet pavement into an extreme sport her usual corporate armor, replaced by the kind of vulnerability that money couldn't hide when circumstances stripped away all pretense. Ryan's thumb hovered over the iPhone screen cursor blinking beside a message thread that felt loaded with implications beyond its digital simplicity. He could delete the text, pretend it had never arrived, merge into Aurora Avenue traffic, and disappear into the vast anonymity of Seattle's night shift economy. Every rational calculation supported retreat. Jessica Walsh had destroyed his career without providing explanation or displaying remorse, had forced him to move Lily from their ballad craftsman to a Greenwood apartment where they measured grocery budgets in quarters and counted coupons like currency. But Lily's voice echoed through the Honda's recycled air conditioning with the persistence of conscience, given form. "We help people, Daddy. Not because they deserve it, but because helping is what good people do." 3 weeks ago, she'd returned from Broadview Elementary with tears streaking her cheeks and a question that had ambushed his heart. "Emma says my lunch looks poor kid sad. Why should I share my art supplies with someone who makes fun of what we can afford?" Ryan had knelt to her eye level in their cramped kitchen, the one where they shopped with coupons cut from Sunday newspapers, and celebrated small victories like finding name-brand cereal marked down to generic prices. He'd taken her paint-stained fingers in his work-roughened hands and offered the kind of wisdom that sounded simple but required daily practice. Because kindness isn't about whether people deserve it, sweetheart. It's about who we choose to be when being kind is hardest. She'd processed this with the gravity that 7-year-olds brought to concepts that challenged their understanding of fairness. Even when they're mean first, especially then. Being good to people who are good to you is easy. Being good to people who aren't good to you. That's when you discover what you're really made of. The next day, Lily had shared her 64-count Crayola set with Emma. Richardson had returned home with stories of collaborative artwork and the beginning of friendship forged from forgiveness and primary colors. "You were right, Daddy," she'd announced over their dinner of boxed macaroni and cautious optimism. Being nice when someone's mean makes your chest feel warm, like drinking hot chocolate for your feelings. Now Ryan sat in October rain watching Jessica Walsh learn what helplessness tasted like, and his daughter's wisdom created gravitational pull against his justified anger. The woman who had reduced him to driving strangers for tips was sending desperate texts to random numbers, hoping anyone might care enough to interrupt their own evening for her emergency. Through the windshield, the lead predator grabbed Jessica's wrist. She twisted away her expensive coat, sliding further off her shoulder to reveal silk that probably cost more than Ryan's monthly rent but offered no protection against men who specialized in exploiting weakness disguised as wealth. Her mouth moved, probably saying no, probably discovering that money only purchased safety when safety was available for purchase. Ryan's memory flashed to that February Thursday when his professional existence had detonated in Jessica's corner office overlooking Elliott Bay. Her voice arctic as Puget Sound in winter. "We're letting you go, Ryan. Effective immediately. No explanation, no apology, no recognition that her corporate directive would force him to explain to Lily why their new apartment had thin walls and their new grocery budget required strategic sacrifice." The second predator moved closer, cutting off Jessica's retreat route toward the street where passing traffic might notice her situation. They were enjoying this, the fear in her eyes, the way her usual command dissolved when stripped of corporate context and reduced to basic human vulnerability. This was entertainment for them, a chance to demonstrate power over someone who probably never questioned her own authority until tonight. Ryan's phone buzzed again. Same message from the same unknown number. "Help me, please." The repetition carried desperation that transcended their professional history, reduced their relationship to its most elemental components. One human being appealing to another for intervention that might prevent permanent damage to both body and spirit. He closed his eyes and heard Lily reading bedtime stories to her stuffed elephant, her voice carrying the moral certainty that animated her favorite fairy tales, and the mouse helped the lion, even though the lion had been mean, because good mice don't keep score when someone needs saving. What kind of world was he helping to create for his daughter? One where kindness was conditional, where mercy depended on prior behavior, where fathers taught children that helping others was optional, based on whether those others had earned assistance through acceptable conduct, or one where strangers interrupted their own emergencies for people who wouldn't make the same choice, where grace given freely created more grace rather than less. The third predator blocked Jessica's path toward the tavern entrance. She was surrounded now, isolated from potential witnesses, trapped in the kind of situation that created newspaper headlines and therapy sessions, and the understanding that some nights changed people permanently, regardless of whether they survived them intact. Ryan thought about the shoebox beneath his bed, containing 57 love notes written in purple crayon. Daily affirmations that he remained someone's definition of heroic. Despite driving strangers for tip money and shopping with coupons and explaining to his daughter why dreams sometimes required rescheduling. What would those notes mean if he chose vengeance over virtue when virtue cost him everything and offered nothing except the knowledge that he'd remained true to the principles he taught her? The phone buzzed a third time. Not a new message, just notification of the existing plea, as if the universe was providing one final opportunity for him to become the man his daughter believed him to be rather than the man his circumstances had made him. Jessica stumbled backward, her heel catching on uneven pavement. The predators moved closer, their circle tightening like a noose made of masculine entitlement and alcohol-fueled confidence. In seconds, this situation would transition from threatening to irreversible, from something Ryan could prevent to something he would have to live with witnessing. He took a breath that tasted like rain and responsibility, like October air seasoned with his daughter's unwavering faith in his character. Through the windshield, Seattle's Capitol Hill pulsed with neon and noise, and the kind of urban indifference that allowed terrible things to happen while decent people found reasons to look away. Ryan Carter, former marketing coordinator. Current rideshare driver, permanent guardian of a 7-year-old's belief in human decency, opened his car door and stepped into the rain, choosing to be the father Lily believed him to be, rather than the victim Jessica Walsh had made him. Ryan's footsteps echoed off wet asphalt like gunshots in a cathedral, each impact reverberating through Capitol Hill's narrow arteries with the finality of decisions that couldn't be undone once made. The rain had intensified, transforming Seattle's after-midnight landscape into an impressionist painting where neon signs bled watercolor light across surfaces that reflected more than just illumination. The alley beside Mickey's Tavern smelled like urban decay, seasoned with desperation, stale beer, mixing with something that might have been vomit, or might have been the accumulated essence of dreams, deferred until they spoiled. Steam rose from manholes like ghosts of better intentions, and somewhere in the acoustic distance, sirens wailed through the night toward emergencies that belonged to other people living other catastrophes in other neighborhoods where consequences came calling at inconvenient hours. The three predators turned at the sound of his approach, their attention shifting from Jessica to this unexpected variable who had the audacity to interrupt their carefully orchestrated entertainment. The tallest one, trust fund confidence wrapped in designer denim, stepped forward with chest inflated by alcohol and the kind of borrowed courage that came from numerical superiority over people who appeared less willing to escalate situations beyond verbal intimidation. "This is a private conversation, friend," he announced, the word friend delivered with sufficient irony to suggest he understood neither friendship nor conversation. His voice carried the slight slur of someone who had discovered liquid confidence in quantities that exceeded his tolerance, but hadn't yet reached the point where motor functions became unreliable. "Why don't you keep walking?" Ryan stopped 12 feet away, close enough to intervene if necessary, distant enough to avoid appearing immediately aggressive. Rain soaked through his rideshare polo shirt. The uniform of Seattle's gig economy, marked with the logos of companies that treated drivers as independent contractors rather than employees worthy of benefits or basic job security. Water ran down his face like tears he refused to shed for a professional life that had ended without explanation or appeal. "She's with me," Ryan said, his voice steady as bedrock, despite the earthquake happening in his chest cavity. "Let her go." The lead predator laughed, a sound like gravel being processed through a garbage disposal, mechanical and unpleasant, and designed to intimidate rather than express genuine amusement. His two companions flanked him like hyenas, recognizing pack leadership. Their body language suggesting they preferred their violence to come with social approval rather than individual responsibility. "Yeah, says who? Exactly." The question carried the kind of aggressive skepticism that bullies used when they sensed weakness, but hadn't yet committed to escalating toward actual physical confrontation. Jessica's eyes found Ryan's face across 12 feet of rain-soaked distance, and recognition dawned like sunrise after the longest night in recorded history. Her mascara had created abstract expressionist patterns down her cheeks, her usually perfect platinum bob hanging in wet strands that spoke of careful grooming defeated by circumstances beyond anyone's control. She looked smaller than he remembered from their corporate interactions, more human, stripped of the executive armor that had once made her seem untouchable. Ryan, his name escaped her lips like a prayer she'd forgotten how to recite properly. Disbelief and shame and desperate hope wrapped into two syllables that carried the weight of 6 months' worth of unspoken apologies. The predators looked confused now, their script disrupted by this development that suggested prior relationship rather than random intervention. Stranger rescues were predictable. They could be handled with escalating threats and calculations about whether potential victims were worth the effort required to discourage heroic gestures. But this felt personal, complicated, like they'd stumbled into someone else's unfinished business and weren't certain about their roles in whatever drama was unfolding. Ryan stepped forward, placing himself between Jessica and her tormentors, and repeated his words with quiet certainty that carried more threat than shouting would have managed. "She's with me." The tallest predator studied Ryan's face, searching for signs of weakness or uncertainty that might make this confrontation easier. He found neither. What he discovered instead was something more dangerous than rage, the calm determination of someone who had already lost everything that corporate spreadsheets measured as valuable, someone with nothing left to lose except his daughter's faith in his character. Someone who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of odds or likely outcomes. "Look, buddy," the leader said, his swagger diminishing as alcohol-fueled confidence encountered sobriety-powered resolve. "We're just having a friendly conversation with the lady. No need to get all heroic about it." "Conversation's over," Ryan replied, his eyes never leaving the leader's face. Behind the man, Elliot Bay stretched toward horizons that promised morning would eventually arrive to wash away whatever darkness occurred in these narrow spaces between buildings where decent people became statistics. And statistics became footnotes in police reports that no one read completely. The second predator, stockier than his leader, compensating for height deficiency, with aggressive body language, stepped closer with the kind of false bravado that suggested he'd never been in an actual fight, but had watched enough movies to believe he understood the choreography. "Maybe we should teach this guy some manners about minding his own business." But the leader raised his hand in a gesture that acknowledged street mathematics. One man protecting someone often fought harder than 3 men looking for easy entertainment. There was something in Ryan's posture, something in the quiet certainty of his voice, that suggested this wouldn't be as simple as intimidating a drunk woman who couldn't defend herself effectively. "Not worth the hassle," he muttered loud enough for his companions to hear, but quiet enough to preserve face in the complicated social dynamics that governed pack behavior. "Plenty of other opportunities tonight." They melted back into Capitol Hill's maze of alleys and side streets, like smoke dissipating into larger atmospheric systems, disappearing with the practiced efficiency of predators who understood that successful hunting required choosing appropriate prey rather than engaging in battles that might result in unwanted attention from authorities who frowned on assault charges. Jessica swayed on designer heels that had never been intended for navigating rain-slicked pavement alcohol and adrenaline, and 6 months of buried shame making the world tilt around her like a carnival ride designed by someone who specialized in motion sickness. Ryan caught her elbow before she could collapse his touch, gentle, despite every rational reason to let her experience the full consequences of whatever choices had brought her to this alley at this hour. "I can't," she started, then stopped as words failed to bridge the impossible distance between gratitude and humiliation, between the woman who had fired him without explanation and the woman whose life he had just preserved without being asked. "We need to get you out of here," Ryan said. His voice professionally neutral, as if this were simply another rideshare pickup, as if his heart wasn't performing irregular percussion against his ribs like a jazz drummer improvising during a medical emergency. "Can you walk?" She nodded unconvincingly, though walking appeared to be an optimistic assessment of her current motor capabilities. Ryan guided her toward his Honda Civic, which sat under a streetlight like a faithful companion waiting for its owner's return, 10 years old and dented but dependable in ways that luxury vehicles often weren't, despite their superior sticker prices and enhanced warranty coverage. The passenger door creaked when he opened it, a sound he'd grown accustomed to, but now felt embarrassed by automotive poverty made audible in the presence of someone whose annual income probably exceeded his lifetime earnings potential at current rideshare rates. Jessica stared at the interior with the expression of someone seeing economic reality up close for the first time, cracked dashboard non-functional air freshener, empty coffee cups that told the story of someone working multiple shifts to maintain minimal financial stability. She slid into the seat without protest, her designer coat bunching around her like expensive tissue paper that had been crumpled and discarded before being retrieved for one final use. In the dome light's brief illumination, Ryan could assess the full extent of her dishevelment, torn fabric at the collar, smudged makeup that suggested tears or struggle, the kind of vulnerability that money couldn't conceal when circumstances stripped away all pretense of control. Ryan closed her door gently, walked around to the driver's side, through rain that felt like benediction, and started the engine that had carried him through 6 months of night shifts and financial uncertainty. The radio activated automatically late-night talk show hosts discussing topics that felt irrelevant compared to the complexity of transporting someone who had once terminated your employment, but now depended on your mercy for safe passage through a city that had become hostile territory. He turned off the radio, leaving them in silence, except for rain drumming against the roof, and Jessica's irregular breathing that spoke of panic barely contained beneath whatever pharmaceutical assistance she'd sought at Mickey's tavern. In the passenger seat, she pressed her forehead against cold glass, watching Capitol Hill blur past through tears that mixed regret with relief, in proportions that probably couldn't be calculated, even if measurement mattered at this point. "I'm sorry," she whispered the words barely audible over Seattle's late-night symphony of emergency vehicles and distant traffic, and the electronic hum of a city that never truly slept. "I'm so sorry for everything." Ryan kept his hands positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, the same careful grip he maintained when Lily rode with him, steady and controlled, and designed to deliver precious cargo safely to intended destinations, regardless of weather conditions or external complications that might arise during transit. He didn't respond to the apology immediately, couldn't respond without opening emotional floodgates that might drown them both in accusations and explanations that belonged to daylight conversations rather than midnight emergency evacuations. Instead, he adjusted the heat to combat the chill that had nothing to do with October temperature and everything to do with human beings, discovering that some encounters couldn't be predicted or prepared for, only navigated with whatever grace they could summon when grace felt like the last thing either of them deserved. The silence inside Ryan's Honda Civic possessed weight that seemed to increase proportionally, to the distance they traveled from Capitol Hill's neon-soaked chaos toward the manicured prosperity of Riverside Estates. Rain continued its assault on Seattle's metropolitan landscape, transforming familiar streets into watercolor abstractions where streetlights bled yellow paint across asphalt canvases that reflected more than just automotive illumination. Jessica sat slumped against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass in irregular patterns that spoke of respiratory systems processing alcohol and adrenaline in quantities that exceeded optimal performance parameters. Her designer coat had finally surrendered to gravity, sliding completely off her shoulders to reveal silk fabric that probably cost more than Ryan's monthly rent, but offered no protection against the kind of vulnerability that stripped away pretense regardless of thread count or brand prestige. Ryan navigated Seattle's late-night arteries with the careful precision of someone who'd learned defensive driving through economic necessity rather than traffic school education. The city at 2:47 a.m. resembled a movie set after principal photography had wrapped all atmosphere and mood lighting populated by supporting characters whose stories intersected briefly in traffic patterns before diverging toward destinations that remained mysteries to casual observers. They passed sleeping neighborhoods where people dreamed behind windows that glowed with the warm light of domestic security, drove through commercial districts where 24-hour establishments provided beacons for night shift workers and insomniacs, and others whose circadian rhythms had adapted to urban schedules that prioritized continuous operation over natural sleep cycles. Occasionally, they encountered other vehicles carrying their own cargo of late-night stories, taxicabs delivering airport passengers, delivery trucks, restocking convenience stores, police cruisers patrolling for the kind of trouble that emerged when decent people were safely unconscious in their bedrooms. Jessica's breathing had settled into the deep, irregular rhythm of someone whose central nervous system was processing pharmaceutical assistance and emotional trauma in combinations that created unpredictable neurological results. She murmured something unintelligible, her words dissolving into consonants and vowels that carried emotional weight without forming coherent meaning. Where? She attempted the question, dying in her throat like smoke from extinguished candles. Your house, Ryan replied, his voice carefully modulated to avoid both sympathy and accusation. Riverside Estates, right? The fact that he knew her address shouldn't have surprised her, but it did. Geography had become one of the few weapons available to people who'd been professionally wounded. Research that provided context for resentment, addresses that made poverty feel more personal when you could visualize the wealth that had been prioritized over your family's security. He'd memorized her address during one of those midnight sessions when unemployment had transformed his laptop into an instrument of investigation rather than employment seeking, when anger and insomnia had driven him to construct detailed profiles of the woman who'd destroyed his career without providing explanation or displaying subsequent remorse. They entered Riverside Estates through stone gates that announced prosperity with the subtlety of gold teeth. Brass nameplate catching streetlight, landscaping maintained with the precision that suggested professional gardening services rather than weekend homeowner dedication. The community had been designed to insulate residents from the complications that defined urban living for people whose success was measured in stock options rather than tip calculations. Houses here were positioned like monuments to individual achievement, each structure set back from perfectly maintained roads by lawns that stretched like green carpets, interrupted only by circular driveways and architectural details that suggested European inspiration filtered through American excess. No apartments buildings, no shared walls, no evidence of the economic density that characterized neighborhoods where people like Ryan had learned to measure space by affordability rather than aesthetic preference. Jessica's house commanded the end of Maple Grove Lane, a colonial revival that spoke of old money despite Jessica having earned every dollar herself through corporate climbing that had required sacrifices Ryan was only beginning to understand. Brick facade, white columns, windows that reflected exterior lighting without revealing interior illumination, architecture that suggested stability and permanence, and the kind of generational wealth that transcended individual career fluctuations. Ryan pulled into the circular driveway and turned off the engine, studying the structure that housed his former employer's private life. No porch light welcomed her return, no evidence that anyone waited for her arrival, no signs that this expensive shell served any purpose beyond sheltering accumulated possessions and the woman who'd accumulated them through professional dedication that had apparently cost her everything that made houses into homes. "No one's here," Jessica said, though the observation was redundant, given the complete absence of lights or life signs. "There's never anyone here." The words carried weight that transcended their literal meaning, suggesting loneliness that expensive real estate couldn't cure, isolation that increased rather than decreased with square footage and property values. Ryan studied the house through rain-streaked windshield and recognized the paradox of success that created beautiful spaces for people who had no one to share them with. "Come on," he said, opening his car door to rain that had evolved from drops into sheets that soaked through clothing before you realized you'd gotten wet. "Let's get you inside." The process of extracting Jessica from the Honda required patience and engineering that would have challenged automotive manufacturers. She'd developed the structural integrity of overcooked pasta dead weight that had to be distributed between Ryan's shoulder and his determination not to let her collapse onto Italian marble that would inflict damage requiring medical attention neither of them could afford tonight. The front porch was pristine as everything else about the property. No welcome mat worn smooth by friendly visitors. No potted plants that would have suggested someone cared enough about aesthetics to maintain living decorations. No evidence that this entrance had ever been used for anything, except occasionally admitting its single occupant. Jessica fumbled through her purse with hands that shook from more than cold, searching for keys among the accumulated debris of a woman whose life had become complicated enough to require pharmaceutical assistance for basic emotional management. Credit cards, prescription bottles, breath mints, business cards, and eventually a key ring that she dropped twice before managing to identify the correct piece of metal for the appropriate lock. The front door opened to reveal an interior that looked like a furniture showroom. Everything perfect and nothing personal. Marble floors reflected overhead lighting with the cold efficiency of surfaces designed to impress rather than welcome. Crystal chandelier hung from a ceiling that seemed higher than necessary for human comfort, casting shadows that made the space feel like a museum dedicated to wealth without warmth. No family photographs documented happy memories or important milestones. No books with cracked spines suggested regular reading for pleasure rather than professional development. No magazines folded open to interesting articles indicated casual intellectual curiosity. The living room visible through an archway contained furniture that appeared to have been arranged by professional interior designers who understood aesthetics but had never learned that homes were meant to be lived in rather than photographed for magazines that celebrated style over substance. Jessica made it 3 steps across the marble before her legs gave out alcohol and exhaustion and emotional overload combining to create locomotive failure. Ryan caught her before she could add head trauma to the evening's complications, her weight pulling them both toward an expensive side table that held a single orchid in a crystal vase, beautiful, exotic, and completely artificial, like everything else in this monument, to material success achieved at the cost of human connection. He guided her to the living room couch, a massive sectional in cream leather that probably cost more than his Honda, but had clearly never been used for anything as mundane as family movie nights or Sunday afternoon naps. Jessica collapsed against cushions that had been selected for appearance rather than comfort her expensive coat, finally abandoning all pretense of staying attached to her shoulders. Ryan surveyed the room, searching for something to cover her with some evidence of human comfort in this showcase of material achievement. He found a throw blanket folded with mathematical precision on an accent chair cashmere, judging by the price tag that was probably still attached somewhere and certainly never used for anything as pedestrian as providing warmth to someone who needed it. He shook out the blanket and covered Jessica, tucking it around her shoulders with the same care he showed Lily when she fell asleep during family movie nights in their Greenwood apartment, where every piece of furniture served multiple functions and nothing was too expensive to actually use. From the kitchen, he retrieved a glass of water and located a bottle of acetaminophen beside the sink generic brand, the only evidence in the entire house that its occupant was human enough to occasionally experience headaches or hangovers or other physical reminders that money couldn't purchase immunity from basic biological functions. He set both items on the glass coffee table beside the couch, close enough for Jessica to reach, when consciousness returned, but positioned to avoid becoming hazards if she experienced any nocturnal locomotive difficulties. Then he did something that surprised both of them. Though only he was awake to witness it, he found paper and pen in a kitchen drawer and wrote a note. The handwriting was neat from years of taking meeting notes and drafting client proposals, professional penmanship that had survived his transition from corporate employee to gig economy participant. The message was brief, carrying wisdom that belonged to his daughter, but had been refined through his own recent education in the complicated mathematics of mercy. Everyone deserves to go home safe, even those who hurt us. He left the note beside the water glass and stood looking down at Jessica Walsh, CEO, life destroyer, broken woman, who owned everything material success could provide, but possessed nothing that money couldn't purchase if you knew where to shop for love and community and the kind of wealth that multiplied when shared rather than diminished. Ryan let himself out through the front door, locking it behind him with keys that felt heavier than their physical weight suggested, and walked back to his Honda, through rain that felt like absolution for choices made in darkness when no one was watching except the person in the mirror who would have to live with whatever decisions were made in moments like these. The drive back to Greenwood took him through Seattle's gradual descent from wealth to working class to barely managing past landmarks that marked his own economic trajectory from corporate success to survival mode. Past the Walsh marketing building, where he'd once believed his professional value was secure, past restaurants where he and Lily used to celebrate good report cards when celebration didn't require careful budgeting and strategic sacrifice. At his apartment building, he parked between Mrs. Chen's ancient Toyota and the dumpster behind Golden Dragon Restaurant, climbed stairs that protested under his weight, and stood outside his door listening to the sound of his sleeping daughter breathing through walls thin enough that neighbors' lives became unavoidable soundtrack to your own existence. Inside, Lily slept peacefully in her bedroom arms, wrapped around the stuffed elephant that had witnessed every major life transition since her toddlerhood. Her latest drawing was taped to the refrigerator. 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow that arced over a house that looked nothing like their current apartment, and everything like hope rendered in primary colors that would fade before her faith in him ever would. Ryan stood in his kitchen, still damp from Seattle rain, looking at his daughter's artwork, and thinking about the choice he'd made in that alley. About the woman sleeping alone in a house that cost more than he'd earn in 5 years, surrounded by beautiful objects that couldn't provide the warmth that came from 8-year-old drawings taped to refrigerator doors by people who loved you unconditionally. He'd saved Jessica Walsh tonight, but standing in his kitchen, surrounded by evidence of Lily's unconditional affection and Mrs. Chen's cross-cultural kindness, Ryan realized he might have saved himself as well, because mercy given freely transformed both the giver and the receiver, and choosing to be better than your circumstances was the only victory that mattered when your daughter was watching even in her sleep. Even through walls that couldn't muffle the sound of a father proving himself worthy of the faith she placed in him every morning, when she made his lunchbox and wrote love notes that kept him anchored to hope. Outside, rain continued washing Seattle's streets, preparing the city for tomorrow's chances to choose kindness over convenience, grace over grievance, love over logic in the ongoing human experiment of learning to live together, despite all the reasons we find to live apart. Jessica woke to sunlight that sliced through her living room windows like surgical instruments designed to expose every detail she'd hoped to keep hidden. Her skull felt as though someone had used it for percussion practice, each heartbeat sending waves of pain that competed with the nausea rolling through her stomach like tide coming in over broken glass. The cashmere throw, when had she acquired a cashmere throw, was twisted around her legs like expensive restraints, and 2 white pills sat beside an untouched glass of water on her coffee table. Next to them, a folded piece of paper waited with the patience of judgment deferred but not dismissed. Jessica reached for the note with fingers that trembled from more than hangover, unfolding handwriting she recognized from quarterly reviews and project proposals that belonged to her previous life, when she'd been powerful enough to destroy careers without considering the human cost. Everyone deserves to go home safe, even those who hurt us. The words hit her with the force of recognition that came too late to prevent damage already inflicted. She read them 3 times, her brain struggling to process the magnitude of what Ryan Carter had done for her, this man she'd terminated without explanation, whose daughter she'd forced into poverty through corporate efficiency, that prioritized profit margins over payroll humanity. Memory fragments assembled themselves with reluctant clarity. The bar, the men whose intentions had been written in their body language, the fear that had cut through alcohol fog like ice water through veins. Ryan's voice in the rain, "She's with me." The gentleness with which he'd covered her with this blanket left medication and water like offerings at a shrine she didn't deserve to occupy. Every logical calculation said he should have driven past that alley, should have let her face the consequences of whatever choices had brought her to Mickey's Tavern at 2 a.m. But he'd stopped anyway. Had chosen mercy over mathematics in a way that suggested character she'd never bothered to notice during their professional interactions. Jessica stood slowly, her living room tilting like a ship, navigating rough seas designed by someone who specialized in motion sickness. She made her way to the kitchen, the same sterile space where she consumed takeout dinners alone every night, surrounded by granite countertops that reflected her solitude in fractured pieces. Coffee helped, though not enough. Shower helped more, though the hot water couldn't wash away the memory of how helpless she'd felt when those men had circled her like predators who understood pack-hunting psychology. Looking in her bathroom mirror, she saw someone she barely recognized, not the polished executive who commanded boardrooms, but a woman whose carefully constructed life had nearly collapsed in an alley that smelled like urine and broken promises. In her home office, she opened the desk drawer that contained her most carefully guarded possessions. A photograph of herself, David and Ethan from before everything had fractured. The image was worn from handling, despite her attempts to leave it undisturbed, edges soft from the oils of fingers that couldn't stop tracing the outlines of happiness she'd sacrificed for professional advancement that felt increasingly meaningless. On the back, David's handwriting, "To my forever." The paper had been torn once, straight down the middle, splitting their family photograph the way divorce papers had split their actual family, then taped back together during a moment of weakness, when the silence in this house had become unbearable. Her laptop chimed with 17 unread emails, most demanding immediate attention for problems that felt insignificant compared to waking up in your living room because a man you'd wronged had chosen kindness over vengeance. One message made her breath catch from her attorney's subject line, "Re-custody appeal, final decision." She'd been avoiding it for 4 days, afraid to open a door to hope only to have it slammed shut again by judges who'd already determined she was unfit to share custody of her own son. Now, with Ryan's note still clutched in her trembling hand, she clicked open the message that would either restore partial access to Ethan or confirm that some mistakes carried permanent consequences. "We regret to inform you that your petition for joint custody has been denied." The words blurred as tears she'd been holding back for months finally broke through whatever pharmaceutical barriers she'd constructed against emotional honesty. Denied. She hadn't seen her 9-year-old son in 18 months, hadn't been permitted unsupervised visits since the incident when she'd arrived 20 minutes late and obviously intoxicated to what was supposed to be supervised lunch at McDonald's. Judge Hamilton's words echoed from that final hearing. "Ms. Walsh, this court cannot entrust a child's welfare to someone who prioritizes alcohol over punctuality, who treats court-ordered visitation as optional based on her convenience." Maybe he'd been right. Maybe she was exactly what he'd called her, an unfit mother whose career success couldn't compensate for maternal failure, whose corporate achievements meant nothing if she couldn't show up for the person who mattered most. Jessica scrolled through her phone contacts until she found Ryan's number, the one she'd kept despite every logical reason to delete evidence of employees she'd terminated. Her thumbs hovered over the keyboard, composing messages that sounded like excuses disguised as apologies. "I need to see you, delete." "Thank you seems insufficient, delete." "I owe you an explanation, delete." What words could bridge 6 months of separation, 6 months of him driving strangers for tip money, while she'd continued collecting executive compensation for decisions that destroyed families? What possible language existed for situations where the person you'd wronged had saved your life without being asked? The rideshare staging lot at 6:30 a.m. looked like a Depression-era photograph rendered in morning light, drivers in vehicles that told honest stories about resilience measured in fuel efficiency rather than horsepower. Jessica's black BMW felt obscene among the Toyotas and Hondas that represented practical transportation rather than status symbols. Her wealth suddenly uncomfortable in the presence of people who understood that dignity was maintained through work regardless of hourly compensation. She'd brought coffee, peace offerings from the Starbucks on Pine Street, expensive drinks that might seem condescending to someone whose budget required careful consideration of beverage costs. But gesture mattered more than appropriateness, and she needed her hands to hold something that wasn't trembling with nervous energy that threatened to overwhelm her fragile composure. Ryan stood beside his Honda Civic wearing the same rideshare polo he'd worn 6 months ago when she'd destroyed his career drinking gas station coffee from a cup that probably cost 99 cents compared to her $5 offerings. He looked older, more weathered, marked by night shifts and financial stress, in ways that made her realize she'd never really seen him as human during their professional interactions. Around them, other drivers prepared for morning rush hour with the quiet efficiency of people who'd learned that survival required consistent effort rather than dramatic gestures. Margaret checked her Honda Odyssey's oil-level rosary beads swinging from her rearview mirror. David worked a crossword puzzle, his thermos releasing coffee aromatics that spoke of home brewing rather than coffee shop convenience. Jessica walked toward Ryan carrying her inadequate peace offerings, aware that every step took her further from the safety of her vehicle and closer to a conversation she'd avoided for 6 months but could no longer postpone. "Can we talk?" she asked, holding out one of the cups with hands that betrayed her nervousness, despite pharmaceutical assistance designed to manage anxiety. "Please," Ryan looked at the coffee, then at her face, really looked as if assessing damage that went beyond hangover symptoms. Her eyes were red-rimmed, not just from alcohol, but from tears she'd finally allowed herself to shed, shadowed with exhaustion that suggested her sleeplessness predated last night's emergency. He glanced at his watch with the precision of someone whose time was literally money, whose morning surge pricing meant the difference between making rent and explaining to landlords why payment might be delayed. "I have 12 minutes before rush hour starts. I pick up Lily at 3:15. The mention of his daughter hit Jessica like physical impact, reminding her that her corporate decisions had affected an 8-year-old who painted coffee mugs and wrote love notes in purple crayon. Relief flickered across her features when Ryan accepted the coffee, though he didn't drink immediately, a small gesture that felt enormous in its implications. "There's a park," she said, pointing toward the small green space 2 blocks away where office workers would soon eat lunch and children would play when school ended. "Could we sit? Just for a few minutes?" Ryan checked his phone again, calculating the cost of 12 minutes that could be spent earning money against whatever conversation Jessica needed to have, badly enough to track him down at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning. 11 minutes, he said, walking toward the park with her following like a supplicant approaching confession. The park was tired and small, more of a neighborhood gesture toward green space than an actual retreat from urban reality. A few benches surrounded a fountain that had given up working sometime during the Clinton administration, its concrete bowl now holding only rainwater and the dreams of a city planning committee that had possessed more ambition than maintenance budget. Jessica sat on a stone bench, gripping her coffee cup with both hands like it was an anchor, preventing her from floating away on the tide of consequences that had finally reached her shore. Ryan remained standing, checking his phone, radiating the impatience of someone whose time constraints were measured in dollars rather than convenience. "I remember everything from last night," she began, words rushing out like confession that had been damming up for months. "And I remember what I did to you 6 months ago. I can't pretend any more that it didn't happen, that I didn't destroy your life, because firing you was easier than firing someone who would make my decision difficult." The morning air carried the scent of coffee and impending rain, the sound of traffic beginning its daily crescendo toward rush-hour chaos. Somewhere in the distance, a garbage truck announced the beginning of another workday for people who maintained the infrastructure that kept cities functioning. While more visible professionals took credit for productivity, they couldn't achieve without invisible support systems. "I chose you," Jessica continued, her voice steady now, as if she'd rehearsed this confession in mirrors until it came out clean, "because I knew you wouldn't fight back. The board demanded 20% staff reduction. I fought for weeks, but they threatened my position if I didn't comply with restructuring requirements." Ryan's expression remained neutral, professional, the same controlled demeanor he'd maintained in her office when his world had collapsed in real time while she'd read from corporate scripts about efficiency optimization and market positioning. "So I made a list of people whose termination would create minimal disruption to ongoing projects and client relationships." Jessica said, each word carrying the weight of admitting that human lives had been reduced to variables in equations that balanced corporate books rather than personal budgets. "I put your name on that list because you were kind, because I knew you'd pack your things quietly and walk away without screaming or threatening lawsuits or making me confront what I was really doing to people with mortgages and children and lives that extended beyond quarterly performance metrics." Her throat constricted around words that tasted like glass shards, like acknowledgement of cruelty disguised as business necessity. "I was right, and I hate myself for being right." The confession hung between them like smoke from extinguished candles, visible evidence of damage that couldn't be undone, but might be acknowledged with sufficient honesty and appropriate remorse. Ryan took a slow breath that tasted like coffee and regret. Like morning air, seasoned with the complicated mathematics of forgiveness. "Do you know," he said quietly, his voice carrying 6 months of accumulated pain that had been buried beneath the necessity of providing for Lily while processing his own professional mortality, "what it's like to explain to your 8-year-old daughter why you can't afford her favorite breakfast cereal anymore." Jessica flinched as if his words had physical impact. "Why gymnastics classes had to stop. Why we moved to an apartment where she can hear Mrs. Chen's television through the walls every night." Ryan continued, his voice not rising, but each word carrying surgical precision that cut deeper than shouting could have managed. "You didn't just take my job. You took her stability, her sense of security, her understanding that adults could be trusted to maintain the foundations children need to feel safe in a world that's already too big and too complicated for them to navigate alone. Jessica's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with hangover symptoms and everything to do with recognition that her corporate efficiency had translated into real suffering for people whose names she'd known, but whose humanity she'd never bothered to consider. No, she whispered the admission, scraping her throat raw. I didn't know. But I'm learning now. She reached into her purse with hands that shook from more than caffeine withdrawal, extracting a cream-colored envelope that looked expensive enough to contain legal documents or official correspondence that might change someone's life trajectory. She held it out to Ryan like offering evidence at a trial where she was both prosecutor and defendant. I can't undo what I did, she said, setting the envelope on the bench between them when Ryan didn't immediately accept it. But I can offer this. It's a letter of recommendation to Mitchell and Harding. They're our largest competitor. Better benefits, higher salaries, more opportunities for advancement than Walsh Marketing could provide even before budget restrictions. Ryan stared at the envelope as if it might contain explosives rather than professional opportunity. His expression unreadable in morning light that revealed exhaustion around his eyes and worry lines that hadn't existed 6 months ago. The position is senior marketing strategist. Jessica continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved from confession toward action. 60% higher salary than what you earned with me, full benefits package, including dental and vision company car performance bonuses that reflect actual achievement rather than arbitrary corporate metrics. She met his eyes directly for the first time since they'd sat down, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite the discomfort of seeing her own reflection in someone whose life she'd systematically dismantled. No strings attached. No obligations to me or Walsh Marketing. You've earned this opportunity through competence and character, not through my guilt or your forgiveness. Ryan picked up the envelope, slowly feeling its weight against his fingers, calculating whether redemption could be contained in paper and ink, or whether some damage was too extensive for professional letters to repair. Why now? The question emerged harder than he'd intended. 6 months of suppressed anger finally finding voice. Why do you care what happens to me now? Jessica's face crumpled. But she held herself together through determination that had been refined through months of therapy sessions and recovery meetings, where emotional honesty was both practiced and demanded. Because someone showed me that being decent costs nothing. She said, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed in public spaces. Even to those who hurt us. Even when decency isn't returned or reciprocated or deserved based on prior behavior. The note. His words reflected back through the prism of her recognition that mercy given freely was more powerful than justice earned through transaction. I lost custody of my son, she said suddenly, the confession tumbling out like water through a broken dam. Final appeal denied yesterday. I haven't seen Ethan in 18 months except for supervised visits that I missed because I showed up intoxicated and 20 minutes late to lunch at McDonald's where my 9-year-old was waiting for his mother to prove she cared more about him than about whatever was in the bottle I'd emptied before driving to see him. Ryan's grip on the envelope loosened as recognition dawned that Jessica's professional cruelty might have been driven by personal pain she'd been medicating with alcohol and isolation. I became someone I don't recognize. She continued, words pouring out like confession that had been building pressure for years. Someone my son wouldn't be proud of, someone I can't defend or justify or explain to myself when I look in mirrors that reflect what I've become instead of what I intended to be. She wiped tears with the back of her hand, smearing makeup she'd applied to hide damage that cosmetics couldn't address. Last night, when you could have driven past that alley, you didn't. When you could have let me face consequences I'd earned through choices that brought me to places where successful executives don't usually find themselves. You chose intervention over indifference. Jessica looked directly at him, her expression carrying the kind of vulnerable honesty that came from having nothing left to lose except the possibility of redemption through authentic acknowledgement of harm inflicted. You reminded me that decent people still exist, that I used to be one of them before career advancement became more important than human decency, before I started measuring success in stock options rather than the number of people who trusted me to make decisions that affected their families. Ryan sat in silence that stretched like bridge across the impossible distance between injury and forgiveness, holding an envelope that might contain his professional resurrection while processing the revelation that his former employer was as broken as he was, just differently and more expensively. "I'm not doing this for you," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who needed to establish boundaries even while accepting grace. "I know," Jessica said, relief flooding her expression like sunrise after the longest night she'd ever experienced. "I know you're not." 3 days later, Ryan stood in his Greenwood apartment bathroom, wrestling with a Windsor knot that felt like trying to strangle his own optimism. The navy tie, salvaged from his corporate wardrobe and slightly wrinkled despite his attempts at steam rehabilitation, refused to cooperate with fingers that had grown accustomed to rideshare polo shirts rather than professional menswear. His reflection looked like someone attempting to impersonate his former self-dress shirt, pressed with the iron he'd borrowed from Mrs. Chen slacks that still fit despite months of stress-induced weight loss shoes that had been polished until they almost disguised their age. The man in the mirror appeared professionally competent, but Ryan felt like an actor preparing for a role he'd forgotten how to play. "You look fancy, Daddy," Lily announced from his bedroom doorway, wearing her school uniform and the kind of morning smile that suggested she'd already eaten breakfast without burning anything or creating dishes that required hazmat cleanup protocols. Ryan studied her reflection behind his own, noting the way her Broadview elementary polo shirt was starting to show wear at the collar, how her backpack straps had been reinforced with duct tape that was colorful but couldn't disguise the fact that new backpacks weren't currently within their budget parameters. "Fancy enough for the important job meeting?" he asked finally, achieving victory over the recalcitrant necktie. "More than fancy enough," Lily said, with the absolute certainty that 8-year-olds possessed when rendering judgments about adult appropriateness. "You look like the kind of daddy who knows how to fix important business problems and make companies work better and help people feel happy about their jobs." Her faith in his professional capabilities felt simultaneously inspiring and terrifying, the weight of someone's unconditional belief that you could solve problems that extended far beyond your individual expertise or control. What if Mitchell and Harding discovered he was just another unemployed marketing coordinator with a gap in his resume and references from a position that had ended without explanation? "Are you nervous?" Lily asked, with the emotional intelligence that children developed when they lived in close proximity to adult stress and learned to read atmospheric pressure changes in parental moods. A little Ryan admitted appreciating that she'd asked directly rather than pretending not to notice his anxiety. "But good nervous, like when you had to present your solar system project to the whole class. I was scared everyone would think my Saturn looked more like a fuzzy tennis ball than an actual planet." Lily remembered climbing onto his bed to observe his final preparation rituals. "But Mrs. Patterson said nervousness just means something matters to you, and mattering is good even when it makes your stomach feel like it's full of jumping beans." Ryan smiled, despite the jumping beans currently performing gymnastics in his own digestive system. "That's exactly right. Sometimes being nervous just means you care about the outcome." His phone rang, unknown number with Seattle area code. "Mr. Carter. This is Jennifer from Riverside Elementary." Professional voice, the kind that school administrators used when delivering information that required parental attention. "Lily has developed a fever and needs to be picked up immediately. She's in the nurse's office asking for you." The words hit Ryan like ice water, washing away his carefully constructed morning confidence and replacing it with parental panic that transformed everything else into background noise. What? She was fine 20 minutes ago. Children's temperatures can spike quickly, Jennifer explained with the patience of someone who'd delivered similar news to hundreds of worried parents. She's asking for you specifically, and our policy requires immediate pickup for any student with fever above 100 degrees. Ryan looked at his watch, 8:47 a.m. The Mitchell and Harding interview was scheduled for 9:30 downtown location, requiring 25 minutes in optimal traffic conditions. Rush hour wouldn't cooperate with optimal anything, and parental emergencies didn't respect professional scheduling commitments. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said, already calculating impossible mathematics that required him to be in two places simultaneously. He disconnected and stared at his phone, mind racing through options that all led to devastating choices. Cancel the interview and explain that single parenthood sometimes conflicted with professional obligations. Ask if they could reschedule and risk losing the opportunity to someone whose life didn't include medical emergencies that couldn't be planned around quarterly calendars. Lily sat on his bed unconsciously demonstrating perfect health while her school double probably ran fever hot enough to require immediate extraction from educational premises. The irony felt designed by a universe with a cruel sense of humor. The moment when professional redemption seemed achievable was also the moment when parental responsibility demanded complete attention. Ryan scrolled through his contacts with increasingly desperate efficiency. Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher who occasionally provided childcare, didn't answer her landline. His neighbor Tom worked construction and wouldn't be available until evening. The emergency contact list for divorced fathers with limited support networks was pathetically brief when medical situations required immediate adult response. His thumb hovered over a name he'd never expected to call for personal assistance: Jessica Walsh, the woman who'd destroyed his career, but had somehow become what exactly? Not a friend, certainly not family, but someone who'd demonstrated unexpected capacity for stepping up, when stepping up required personal cost rather than professional gain. This was insane. She wasn't Lily's family member or designated emergency contact. She was the former employer who'd forced them into economic uncertainty, whose recommendation letter currently represented their only pathway back toward financial stability. But his finger pressed her number before rational thought could prevent emotional decision-making. Ryan. Her voice carried surprise, mixed with immediate attention. The tone of someone who understood that unexpected phone calls during business hours usually indicated problems requiring swift response. "I need help," he said, the admission scraping his throat raw with accumulated pride and desperation. "Lily's sick at school. I have the Mitchell and Harding interview in 40 minutes, and there's no one else who can—" "Send me the school address," Jessica interrupted. No hesitation in her voice, no questions about inconvenience or professional appropriateness. "I'll be there in 12 minutes. Jessica. "I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Text me the address now." Ryan sent Riverside Elementary's location through fingers that shook with relief and terror in equal proportions, then called Mitchell and Harding to explain he'd be 15 minutes late due to family emergency. Professional courtesy extended to candidates with strong recommendations, the kind of grace that money could influence when someone important vouched for your character and capabilities. He drove to the school exceeding posted speed limits, his Honda Civic's engine protesting the demands being placed on automotive systems that had been designed for fuel efficiency rather than emergency response. Through his windshield, Seattle's morning traffic moved with the consideration of molasses in refrigerated environments, each red light an additional barrier between him and his daughter, who needed her primary parent to appear and make everything safe again. At Riverside Elementary, Jessica's BMW was already parked in the visitor space, gleaming black metal that looked expensive and out of place among the Subarus and minivans that comprised typical parent transportation. She'd beaten him here by minutes, driving through the same traffic with apparently superior knowledge of shortcuts or less concern for speed limit compliance. Ryan burst through the school's main entrance, past cheerful bulletin boards and the institutional smell of cafeteria food, mixed with disinfectant toward the nurse's office, where his daughter waited for him to prove that parents could be relied upon during medical emergencies, even when medical emergencies conflicted with professional obligations that might determine their family's economic future. He found them in the small room behind the main office, Lily sitting on the examination table, looking pale but alert. Jessica beside her holding his daughter's hand while humming something soft and familiar that seemed to come from muscle memory rather than conscious choice. Lily's voice carried relief, mixed with the peculiar comfort children felt when their primary adult arrived to make sense of situations that exceeded their understanding or control. Ryan crossed the room in 3 steps, gathering his daughter against his chest and feeling the fever heat radiating through her small body, like evidence of battles being fought by immune systems still learning to distinguish between threats that required full mobilization versus minor skirmishes that could be resolved through rest and acetaminophen. The school nurse, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been helping worried parents navigate medical decisions for 15 years, stepped forward with reassuring competence. Temperature is 101.2, Mr. Carter. Probably viral, nothing that requires emergency room visits, but she needs to go home and rest until fever breaks completely. Ryan nodded relief and panic competing for dominance in his central nervous system. Lily was safe, would be fine with proper care, but the interview loomed like professional salvation that required his immediate presence in downtown locations, while his daughter needed his immediate presence in pediatric contexts. "I can take her to the doctor," Jessica said quietly, her offer delivered without pressure or expectation of gratitude. "Get her properly examined while you handle your interview obligations." Ryan's first instinct was refusal based on principles about parental responsibility that couldn't be delegated to former employers, who demonstrated questionable judgment regarding employee welfare. But Lily's head was heavy against his shoulder, her body radiating heat that spoke of immune systems working harder than usual, and sometimes being a good parent meant accepting help from unexpected source. Swedish Medical Center, he said. Finally, the decision feeling like stepping off cliffs toward unknown landing sites. Pediatric department. "I'll meet you there in 90 minutes. Jessica nodded with the seriousness of someone accepting responsibility for something more valuable than her own comfort or convenience. "I'll take good care of her." Ryan kissed Lily's forehead, tasting fever salt, and the metallic tang of worry that parents learned to recognize when their children's health required adult decision-making. "Daddy has to go to his important meeting," he murmured against her hair. "Miss Jessica will take you to the doctor. Okay?" Lily pulled back to study his face with the gravity that children brought to moments when adult world complications intruded on their simple universe of school and home and predictable routines. "The job meeting that's gonna make everything better?" she asked, 8 years old, and already understanding that some conversations carried more weight than others. That meeting, Ryan confirmed, his chest tight with love and terror, in proportions that defied mathematical calculation. "Then you should go," Lily said with matter-of-fact wisdom that made his eyes burn. "I'll be safe with Miss Jessica. She knows songs that make sick feelings smaller." Ryan transferred his daughter into Jessica's arms, watching his most precious person curl against someone who'd once been his professional enemy, but who was now accepting responsibility for his child's welfare during medical emergencies that required adult supervision and judgment. "Thank you," he whispered inadequate words for the magnitude of trust being exchanged between people whose relationship had been redefined by circumstances neither of them could have predicted or planned for. "Go," Jessica said, adjusting her hold on Lily with careful competence that suggested she remembered how to care for sick children, even if her own parenting experience had been interrupted by divorce proceedings and custody battles. "We'll be fine." Ryan left them there in the nurse's office, his daughter and the woman who'd fired him, and drove toward downtown Seattle, through traffic that seemed determined to test his faith in both punctuality and the possibility that some interviews were worth the risk of trusting former enemies with precious cargo that couldn't be replaced if damaged. The interview itself passed in a blur of competent responses to predictable questions, professional conversations about marketing strategies and client relationship management that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign after 6 months of rideshare driving. But throughout the discussion, his phone remained silent. No emergency calls from Jessica suggesting medical complications that exceeded pediatric urgent care capabilities. When he walked out of Mitchell and Harding 47 minutes later with a job offer and salary terms that would allow Lily to return to gymnastics classes, Ryan realized that accepting help had been the right choice, not just for his professional prospects, but for Lily's understanding that sometimes families extended beyond biological boundaries when people chose to show up for each other during emergencies that tested everyone's capacity for grace under pressure. Ryan pushed through Swedish Medical Center's pediatric wing doors at 11:58 a.m., still wearing his interview suit, but with his tie loosened and hair disheveled from running through 3 parking structures, searching for available spaces that wouldn't require additional loan applications to afford hourly rates. The fluorescent lighting felt harsh after the warm confidence of conference rooms, where he'd just secured their financial future, and antiseptic smells triggered memories of Lily's birth 9 years ago. The same controlled chaos, the same sense that important developments happened in hospitals, while ordinary people navigated extraordinary moments. The job offer sat in his jacket pocket like a talisman against poverty. Senior marketing strategist position salary that would restore their ability to afford brand-name cereal and dental checkups benefits package that included vision care and prescription coverage, and the kind of security that transformed monthly bill paying from strategic anxiety into routine administration. But none of that would matter if something was seriously wrong with Lily. The pediatric department had been painted in colors that attempted therapeutic cheerfulness. Mint green walls decorated with cartoon animals that smiled with determination, that felt forced as if artistic optimism could cure whatever brought children and worried parents through these doors during school hours when healthy children should be learning multiplication tables rather than having temperatures monitored by medical professionals. Room 214, the receptionist informed him with practiced kindness that suggested she'd directed hundreds of worried parents toward destinations where their children waited for them to appear, and transform medical uncertainty into parental confidence through sheer force of adult presence. Ryan followed painted footprints on linoleum floors, past rooms where other families managed their own medical emergencies, with varying degrees of success and composure. The hallway carried the subdued acoustic signature of institutional buildings designed to facilitate healing soft conversations between medical professionals, electronic beeping from monitoring equipment, the distant sound of children who were healthy enough to become restless during extended waiting periods. He found them in room 214, and the scene stopped him in the doorway. Jessica sat in the visitor's chair beside the hospital bed, Lily curled against her side like a bird seeking warmth from an unexpected source. His daughter slept deeply, her breathing even, and unlabored her face peaceful in the way that suggested fever had broken, and immune systems had successfully negotiated temporary truces with whatever viral invaders had disrupted her morning educational schedule. An IV line connected Lily's arm to a bag of clear fluid designed to restore hydration levels that had been compromised by fever and the kinds of physiological stress that made small bodies work harder than usual to maintain optimal operating temperatures. Monitors provided electronic reassurance through steady beeping that measured heartbeats and oxygen saturation with mathematical precision that transformed parental worry into data points that could be interpreted by people with medical training. But it was the sound that made Ryan's breath catch, Jessica humming softly, while her fingers moved through Lily's hair with unconscious gentleness, the same melody he'd heard at school earlier, but hadn't identified until now. A lullaby that seemed to emerge from muscle memory rather than conscious recollection, something that suggested she'd once sung to children during bedtime routines when maternal duties had been part of her daily responsibilities. Jessica looked up when she sensed his presence, her expression transforming with relief that carried maternal satisfaction, the kind of emotional response that came from successfully shepherding someone else's child through medical uncertainty until proper parental authority could resume responsibility for decision-making and recovery supervision. "She's fine," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the quiet symphony of hospital equipment that monitored Lily's return to health. Viral infection probably picked up at school. They gave her IV fluids for mild dehydration and children's Tylenol for fever reduction. Doctor says she'll be completely recovered by tomorrow morning. Ryan approached the bed carefully, as if sudden movements might disturb the peaceful scene that suggested all emergencies had been successfully managed during his absence. He touched Lily's forehead, confirming that her temperature had returned to normal ranges that didn't require medical intervention or parental panic responses. Relief hit him like physical impact, making his legs unsteady and his chest tight with gratitude he couldn't adequately express through conventional vocabulary. For 2 hours he'd maintained professional composure during conversations about quarterly projections and client retention strategies, while his parental nervous system processed low-level terror about medical possibilities that exceeded his ability to control or influence. "Thank you," he managed, voice rough with suppressed emotion that had been building pressure since Jessica had agreed to become temporary guardian for his most precious responsibility. "I don't know how to thank you for this." "You don't need to," Jessica replied, still stroking Lily's hair with the kind of automatic gesture that suggested she'd retained maternal reflexes despite 18 months of separation from her own child. "She's been wonderful company. Told me about her art projects and her best friend Maya and how she's learning to play chess from Mrs. Chen through the apartment walls." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Lily sleep the deep sleep of children whose bodies were directing all available energy toward healing processes that operated more efficiently during unconscious states. The afternoon light filtering through hospital windows carried the golden quality that transformed even institutional settings into something warm and hopeful. Lily stirred, eyelids fluttering like butterfly wings before opening to focus on Ryan with the immediate alertness that children possessed when important adults arrived at their bedside. Her smile transformed her pale features into something radiant, despite IV tubes and hospital gowns that made her appear smaller than usual. "Did you get the job, Daddy?" she asked, her first concern directed toward his professional prospects rather than her own medical situation. The question hit Ryan with the full weight of someone whose 8-year-old daughter carried adult worries about family financial stability, who understood that some meetings determined whether they could afford gymnastics classes and name-brand groceries and apartments with walls thick enough to provide acoustic privacy. "I got it," he confirmed, watching joy replace concern in her expression. "Senior marketing strategist at Mitchell & Harding. Good salary, full benefits, company car for business travel." Lily's smile widened until it threatened to exceed the physical limitations of her face. "I knew you would get it. You're too smart for them to say no, and you look really professional in that tie, even though it makes your neck look uncomfortable." Then she turned to Jessica with the openness that children showed to adults who'd proven themselves trustworthy during moments that mattered. "Miss Jessica stayed with me the whole time. She knows the same song my first mummy used to sing when I was little and scared about thunderstorms." Ryan's breath caught. Lily's biological mother had abandoned them when Lily was 4 years old, declaring herself unprepared for maternal responsibilities that interfered with personal freedom and professional opportunities that didn't include child-rearing obligations. They hadn't heard from her in 5 years, and Lily rarely mentioned memories from before her departure. "You remember that song?" Ryan asked gently, understanding that some memories were fragile and required careful handling to avoid damaging whatever emotional connections remained from early childhood experiences. Lily nodded with the seriousness that children brought to conversations about topics they didn't fully understand, but recognized as important to adults. "Mummy sang it when I had bad dreams, or when thunder was too loud. It made the scared feelings get smaller, like magic, but with music instead of wands. Jessica had gone very still, her hand frozen in Lily's hair, while tears gathered in her eyes like evidence of emotional recognition that transcended their immediate circumstances. "My son loved that song too," she said quietly, her voice thick with suppressed longing for a child she hadn't been permitted to comfort during nightmares or thunderstorms, or any of the small emergencies that required maternal presence. "I used to sing it to Ethan every night before bed until he got too old for lullabies or I got too broken to be trusted with bedtime routines." Lily sat up despite medical equipment that required careful navigation, her interest sparked by the mention of another child who shared her musical preferences. "You have a kid. Where is he?" The question landed with the brutal honesty that only children possessed when they wanted information about adult complications they couldn't understand but sensed were significant to people they cared about. Jessica's throat worked visibly, the kind of physical struggle that came from attempting to explain complex emotional territory to someone whose worldview didn't include categories for mothers who'd lost access to their own children. "He lives with his daddy," Jessica said finally, truth delivered with careful simplicity that avoided details inappropriate for 8-year-old ears. "Far away from here. I don't get to see him very often because I made some mistakes that hurt him, and now I'm trying to learn how to be better. So maybe someday he'll want to see me again." Lily processed this information with the gravity she brought to all revelations about adult complications that affected children's understanding of how families were supposed to function. "Does he know you're a hero?" she asked with characteristic directness. What? Jessica's voice broke on the word. "You saved me today," Lily explained with matter-of-fact certainty that brooked no argument. "When I was sick and scared, and Daddy couldn't be here because of his important job, meeting you came. And you sang the magic song that makes bad feelings smaller. That's what heroes do. They show up when people need them, and they know how to make scary things less scary." Jessica's composure finally cracked, tears flowing freely, while she tried to maintain adult dignity in front of a child who'd just redefined heroism in terms she could understand and accept. She pressed her hand to her mouth, attempting to contain sobs that had been building pressure for months of separation from her own child and years of believing she'd forfeited any right to maternal identity through professional choices that prioritized corporate advancement over family stability. Ryan placed his hand on Jessica's shoulder, the gesture surprising both of them, but feeling natural in the context of shared concern for Lily's welfare and mutual recognition that some moments transcended professional history or personal grievances. "It's not too late," he said. Words carrying the weight of someone who'd learned that redemption was possible when people committed to earning second chances through consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures. "You can call him." Jessica shook her head, despair winning temporary victory over hope that felt too fragile to trust completely. "He won't answer. I've tried. He's 9 years old, and he's learned that his mother is unreliable. That promises from me carry expiration dates that loving me means getting disappointed when I choose alcohol over attendance at school plays and birthday parties." Lily reached out and took Jessica's hand with the unself-conscious affection that children offered to adults, who'd demonstrated safety through consistent presence rather than grand promises. "Everyone needs second chances," she said, her voice carrying wisdom that exceeded her age by several decades. "My daddy says being brave isn't about not feeling scared. Being brave is feeling scared and doing the right thing anyway." The words hit Jessica like revelation, like recognition of truth she'd been avoiding, because facing it required more courage than maintaining the familiar patterns of guilt and self-medication that had become comfortable in their predictability. "You think I should call him?" she asked, seeking permission from an 8-year-old whose opinion suddenly mattered more than expert advice or therapeutic recommendations. "I think scared people need to hear that someone loves them," Lily replied with the absolute certainty that children possessed when they stated obvious truths that adults sometimes forgot. Even when loving someone is scary because they might not love you back the same way. Jessica looked at Ryan, fear and hope competing for dominance in her expression, while she contemplated making a phone call that might bridge 18 months of silence or confirm that some distances were too great for love to cross. He nodded. Encouragement, understanding that sometimes the most important calls were the ones that terrified you most because the outcomes mattered enough to justify the risk of rejection or disappointment. Jessica pulled out her phone with hands that shook from more than caffeine withdrawal. Scrolling to a contact she'd preserved, despite every logical reason to delete evidence of relationships that had been severed by her own choices and limitations. Ethan Walsh. 9 years old, probably taller than she remembered, definitely changed by experiences she hadn't been present to witness or help him navigate. Her thumb hovered over the call button like prayer waiting to be answered or rejected by forces beyond her control. "We'll stay," Ryan said, sensing her terror of facing this moment alone. "If you want company." "Please," Jessica whispered the word, carrying desperate gratitude for witnesses to whatever happened next. For people who might remember this moment of courage, even if courage didn't produce the outcomes she hoped for. She pressed call and held the phone to her ear, while Ryan and Lily watched all three of them, understanding that some conversations changed everything that came after them, regardless of whether they succeeded or failed in their immediate objectives. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each electronic tone, measuring the distance between intention and outcome, between hope and reality, between mothers and sons who'd been separated by circumstances that might or might not be reversible, through sufficient determination and authentic remorse. Then a young voice answered, cautious and distant. "Mom." 4 months later, Ryan stood in his corner office on the 8th floor of Mitchell and Harding, watching Seattle's spring rain transform downtown into an impressionist painting where Pike Place market vendors arranged flowers beneath umbrellas that looked like colorful mushrooms sprouting from concrete. The view from this altitude was different, cleaner, fuller of possibility, painted in the kind of natural light that made even corporate buildings look like they belonged in the urban ecosystem rather than dominating it through architectural aggression. His desk had evolved into a carefully curated collection of professional necessities and personal talismans, the coffee mug Lily had painted in kindergarten, now promoted from survival tool to sentimental centerpiece, a nameplate that still felt like someone else's accomplishment, and a framed photograph of Lily executing a perfect cartwheel in her new gymnastics leotard, captured mid-rotation with the kind of athletic joy that justified every interview. Anxiety and career transition challenge he'd endured. The morning commute no longer felt like exile to economic purgatory. His Honda Civic had been supplemented by a company Subaru Outback practical transportation that reflected Mitchell and Harding's Pacific Northwest sensibilities, while providing all-weather reliability that Seattle's climate demanded. He picked Lily up from Broadview Elementary every afternoon at 3:15, their conversations during the drive home filled with details about math tests and recess politics and art projects that required parental assistance with glue gun operation. Their Greenwood apartment remained functionally adequate, but Ryan had been examining rental listings in neighborhoods where children could walk to playgrounds without navigating traffic patterns designed for commuter efficiency rather than pedestrian safety. Nothing extravagant, just somewhere with a yard large enough for Lily to plant sunflowers and practice cartwheels. Somewhere with walls substantial enough that neighbors' television programming became background comfort rather than unavoidable entertainment. His laptop chimed with an instant message from Jessica. Ethan's birthday is next weekend. Pool party at my house. Would you and Lily like to join us? Over the past 4 months, Jessica had become integrated into their lives through incremental gestures that felt organic rather than obligatory. She'd attended Lily's school art show, her presence announced by genuine enthusiasm for 8-year-old creativity rather than adult obligation disguised as interest. When Ryan had needed emergency childcare during a client crisis that required evening work, Jessica had volunteered to supervise homework and bedtime routines with the kind of competence that suggested she remembered how to parent despite 18 months of court-ordered separation from her own child. For Lily's 9th birthday, Jessica had contributed a gift certificate to Dick Blick Art Materials, not expensive enough to feel inappropriate, not impersonal enough to suggest she didn't understand Lily's preferences, but exactly calibrated to demonstrate that she'd been paying attention during conversations about artistic ambitions and creative projects that required supplies beyond basic classroom provisions. The transformation at Walsh Marketing Solutions had been observable even from outside the company's operations. Industry publications noted improved employee retention rates and innovative client service programs that reflected leadership philosophy changes at the executive level. Former colleagues who'd remained at the firm reported that Jessica had implemented mental health benefits and family emergency leave policies that prioritized human needs over productivity metrics. During the quarterly marketing summit at the Washington Trade and Convention Center, Jessica had publicly acknowledged the restructuring mistakes of the previous year, announcing an employee support fund designed to assist current and former staff members who'd been affected by budget reductions that had prioritized shareholder profits over workforce stability. The gesture was professional rather than personal, but Ryan recognized it as evidence that some lessons learned through personal crisis could be translated into systemic improvements that benefited people who hadn't been directly involved in individual redemption narratives. Their Saturday morning coffee meetings had evolved into a tradition that neither of them had explicitly established, but both had come to depend upon. They met at Volunteer Park, where the conservatory provided backup shelter during Seattle's inevitable precipitation events, discussing topics that ranged from recovery program milestones to single parenting logistics to the complicated mathematics of building trust after betrayal had established prior relationship parameters. Last Saturday, Jessica had shared photos on her phone. Ethan at a Mariners game, both of them wearing matching team caps and grinning with the unself-conscious joy of people who'd rediscovered shared interests. The two of them attempting to construct a bookshelf from IKEA instructions surrounded by assembly debris, and laughing at their mutual incompetence with Swedish engineering philosophy, a selfie from the Seattle Center, Jessica's arm around her son while the Space Needle provided backdrop for their tentative reunion. "He's giving me another chance," she'd said, her voice carrying wonder at grace received rather than demanded. "Supervised visits twice a week, overnight stays once a month. David says if consistency continues, he'll consider increasing the schedule to include school pickups and summer vacation time." "How are you handling it?" Ryan had asked. Understanding that maintaining sobriety while rebuilding relationships required navigation of emotional territories that could trigger relapse if managed without sufficient support systems. One day at a time, Jessica had replied with the practiced honesty that came from recovery programs, where clichés carried weight because they'd been tested through repeated application. "Some days are easier than others, but I've learned that being a good mother isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up consistently and being honest about your limitations while working to expand them." Now responding to her text about Ethan's birthday party, Ryan typed, "We'd love to come. What can we bring?" The reply came immediately. "Just yourselves. I'm attempting to grill hamburgers without creating charcoal sculptures that require archaeological excavation." His computer pinged with an email from the Morrison account. The campaign he'd developed had exceeded client expectations by 38%, generating social media engagement levels that surprised both Mitchell and Harding's analytics team and Morrison's executives, who'd been skeptical about hiring a marketing strategist whose previous position had ended under circumstances that remained diplomatically undefined in professional conversations. Success felt different now, measured not just in client satisfaction scores, but in Lily's bedtime stories, and Jessica's tentative smiles, and the understanding that professional achievement meant nothing if you lost your humanity while pursuing it. The corner office with its 8th-floor view was impressive, but what mattered was the ability to leave at 5 o'clock for grocery shopping, with Lily helping her select ingredients for dinner recipes that had graduated from survival mode to actual family meal planning. Tom Mitchell, the senior partner who'd hired him, based primarily on Jessica's recommendation letter, appeared in his doorway carrying coffee that suggested he'd made time for conversation rather than brief professional consultation. "Excellent work on the Morrison campaign," Tom said, settling into the chair that faced Ryan's desk. "Client specifically requested you for their Q3 product launch. That's unusual for first-year associates, even ones with your experience level." Ryan accepted the compliment while recognizing that his experience level included 6 months of driving strangers through Seattle's night shift economy education that hadn't appeared on his resume, but had taught him more about customer service psychology than any corporate training program could have provided. "I appreciate the opportunity," Ryan replied, meaning it completely. Morrison's team made collaboration easy. They understood that effective marketing requires authentic connection between products and consumer needs, rather than manipulation disguised as persuasion. "That perspective is exactly why Jessica recommended you so strongly." Tom continued his expression, suggesting he knew more about Ryan's employment history than professional courtesy required him to acknowledge. "She said you understood that businesses succeed when they remember they're serving human beings rather than demographic categories." The mention of Jessica's role in his hiring felt simultaneously gratifying and complicated evidence that her letter of recommendation had carried sufficient influence to override concerns about his unexplained departure from Walsh Marketing, but also a reminder that his current success was connected to her decision to help him rather than to his individual merit, independent of her intervention. "She wrote a compelling case for your character," Tom added, rising to leave with the efficient grace of someone whose time was allocated in 15-minute increments. "Character matters more than credentials in this business. Credentials can be taught. Character has to be demonstrated through choices people make when they think no one important is watching." After Tom left, Ryan sat at his desk thinking about choices made in rain-soaked alleys, about Jessica's transformation from corporate efficiency expert to human being who prioritized people over productivity metrics, about the strange alchemy that had transformed professional enemies into something approaching family through accumulated acts of grace offered without expectation of reciprocal benefit. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily, a photo she'd taken during recess, showing a rainbow that arced over Broadview Elementary's playground equipment. The message read, "Saw this and thought about how sometimes beautiful things happen after storms. Love you, Daddy." 9 years old, and she was already understanding metaphorical relationships between meteorological phenomena and life experiences, already recognizing that difficulty often preceded beauty in sequences that couldn't be rushed or avoided, but had to be endured with sufficient patience and faith. That improvement was possible even when evidence suggested otherwise. Ryan saved the photo to his phone's gallery, where it joined hundreds of others' documentation of a childhood that was no longer defined by economic uncertainty or parental anxiety about providing adequate stability for someone whose happiness mattered more than any professional achievement he might accomplish. Outside, Seattle's spring rain continued transforming the city into something cleaner and more hopeful, washing away the accumulated grime of urban winter and preparing surfaces for whatever growth might be possible when conditions became favorable for new beginnings. Somewhere in that rain-soaked landscape, Jessica was probably planning Ethan's birthday party with the nervous enthusiasm of someone who'd learned that second chances required careful tending to flourish into sustainable relationships. Tomorrow would bring new client meetings and strategic planning sessions, and all the ordinary demands that comprised successful professional life. Tonight would bring grocery shopping, with Lily homework supervision, bedtime stories, that transported them both to imaginary kingdoms where problems had clear solutions and heroes always triumphed through persistence rather than luck. But this moment, sitting in his office with afternoon light streaming through windows that reflected his reflection back to him, belonged to gratitude for the chain of choices that had led from that rainy night outside Mickey's tavern to this corner office where he earned enough to afford Lily's gymnastics classes and dental checkups and all the ordinary securities that children deserved but couldn't obtain for themselves. Some gifts couldn't be earned through hard work or deserved through good behavior. They could only be received with appropriate humility and protected through daily choices to prove yourself worthy of the grace you'd been given. Ryan had learned to live in that space between gratitude and responsibility, between the person he'd been and the person he was becoming, in the knowledge that saving someone else was often exactly how you saved yourself. The evening before Ethan's 10th birthday party, Jessica stood in her Riverside Estates kitchen at 6 p.m., surrounded by the aromatic chaos of someone attempting to prepare a family dinner without the benefit of extensive culinary education or recent practice feeding people other than herself. Marinara sauce bubbled on the stove top, with threatening intensity garlic bread occupied oven space with the kind of precise timing that separated the successful meals from smoke alarm incidents, and a salad waited in the refrigerator like the only menu item she couldn't possibly destroy through overconfidence or inadequate attention to detail. The house had transformed itself around the possibility of regular occupancy by people other than its primary owner. Photographs now decorated the mantelpiece, not the sterile professional portraits that interior designers recommended, but candid shots of Ethan at baseball games, Jessica and her son constructing elaborate Lego spaceships, David and Sarah's wedding, where Ethan had served as ring-bearer with the solemnity of someone entrusted with crucial ceremonial responsibilities. Lily's artwork had claimed refrigerator real estate crayon drawings that depicted their extended family as stick figures holding hands beneath rainbows that defied meteorological possibility but accurately represented emotional reality as perceived by 9-year-old observers who understood that families could expand rather than contract when people chose inclusion over competition. The dining room table, previously used only for important paperwork and laptop computing, had been set for 6 people with china that had never been removed from protective storage until Jessica decided that special occasions required actual celebration rather than theoretical acknowledgement. Cloth napkins serving dishes that matched centerpiece flowers from the Pike Place market vendor who'd assured her that tulips symbolized rebirth and new beginnings, though she'd purchased them primarily because they were colorful enough to suggest festivity without requiring expertise in floral arrangement theory. Ryan and Lily arrived at 6:30, carrying a bottle of wine and a container of homemade cookies that Lily had insisted on baking despite Jessica's assurance that dessert was already planned. They knocked rather than using the doorbell, a small gesture that suggested familiarity without presuming intimacy. Respect for boundaries that had been carefully negotiated through months of tentative friendship building. "Something smells wonderful," Ryan said, as Jessica opened the front door, though his expression suggested he was being diplomatically optimistic about the aromatic evidence emerging from her kitchen experimentation. "Something smells like I'm learning to cook for people other than myself," Jessica corrected, accepting the wine and admiring the cookies that Lily presented with the pride of someone who'd successfully operated oven equipment without adult supervision. "These look professional quality. I only burned the first batch a little bit," Lily confided with the honesty that children brought to discussions of culinary disasters. "Daddy says even professional chefs burn things. Sometimes they just don't tell customers about the mistakes that happen before the good food comes out." David and Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, bringing Ethan and a gift bag that contained whatever 10-year-old boys currently considered essential for birthday happiness. The greetings were warm but slightly formal, the careful courtesy of divorced parents who'd learned to navigate shared custody responsibilities without recreating the conflicts that had originally necessitated legal intervention in their family structure. Ethan looked taller than Jessica remembered from their previous visit, his face showing the subtle changes that marked the transition from child to adolescent in ways that reminded her how much time she'd missed during 18 months of court-ordered separation. But he hugged her with genuine affection, the kind of physical contact that suggested their rebuilding relationship had progressed beyond obligatory politeness toward authentic emotional connection. "The house looks different," he observed, studying the family photographs and children's artwork with the analytical attention that children brought to changes in familiar environments. "More like people actually live here instead of just visiting." "That's because people do live here now," Jessica replied, understanding that people included not just herself, but the extended network of relationships that had made her house feel like home, rather than expensive storage facility for accumulated possessions. "Your artwork is on the refrigerator. Lily's drawings are in the hallway, and there are board games in the living room that actually get used for entertainment, rather than decorative purposes." Dinner conversation flowed with the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned to include each other in their lives, despite the complicated logistics that defined modern blended family dynamics. Ethan dominated discussion with detailed analysis of his social studies project about Pacific Northwest Native American tribes, demonstrating the kind of intellectual enthusiasm that suggested his academic performance had remained stable despite his parents' divorce and his mother's temporary absence from regular parenting responsibilities. Lily listened with the respectful attention she showed to all educational topics that exceeded her current grade level, occasionally asking questions that proved she was following Ethan's explanation, despite the complexity of historical concepts that involved cultural differences and geographical adaptation strategies that required sophisticated understanding of cause and effect relationships. The Maka tribe hunted whales using canoes carved from single cedar trees, Ethan explained with the authority of someone who'd spent considerable research time mastering his subject. But they only hunted what they needed to feed their families, and they used every part of the whale, so nothing was wasted, because they understood that respecting nature meant taking only what you needed and being grateful for what you received. "That's like how Daddy says we should treat people," Lily observed with the kind of philosophical connection-making that impressed adults who'd forgotten how children processed moral concepts through practical application. "Take only what you need from friendships, and always be grateful when someone shares something important with you." The adults exchanged glances that suggested they'd all learned something from 9-year-old wisdom about reciprocity and gratitude in relationships that couldn't be measured through material exchange, but required emotional accounting that prioritized mutual benefit over individual advantage. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where board games had been arranged on the coffee table, with the kind of strategic selection that suggested Jessica had researched age-appropriate entertainment options that could accommodate diverse skill levels without creating competitive dynamics that might undermine family harmony. "Monopoly or Scrabble?" Sarah asked, examining the options with the tactical consideration of someone who understood that game selection could determine whether evening entertainment enhanced family bonding or created opportunities for arguments about rules interpretation and winning strategies. "Monopoly." Ethan and Lily declared simultaneously their enthusiasm for real estate acquisition, apparently transcending age differences and social boundaries that might have created barriers in other contexts. The game devolved into the cheerful chaos that occurred when children took charge of financial transactions that involved imaginary money and property ownership concepts that bore no relationship to actual economic reality. Ethan appointed himself banker with the seriousness of someone entrusted with fiduciary responsibility, while Lily approached real estate development with the optimistic aggression of someone who believed that owning railroads was inherently more valuable than accumulating boring properties that didn't involve transportation infrastructure. As the evening progressed toward bedtime schedules that required attention to school night responsibilities, Jessica found herself observing the scene with the kind of emotional satisfaction that had been absent from her life for so long She'd forgotten what contentment felt like when it wasn't artificially induced through pharmaceutical assistance. David and Sarah prepared to take Ethan home to the house where he spent school nights, but the farewell process had evolved from formal custody exchange to casual family gathering conclusion. Plans were confirmed for tomorrow's birthday party, logistics discussed for pickup times and dietary restrictions, and the kind of organizational details that defined successful celebrations for people who'd learned to prioritize joy over perfection. "Thank you for tonight," David said, as they gathered coats and backpacks and the accumulated debris of family dinner that included leftover cookies and art projects that had been spontaneously created during post-meal entertainment. "This feels normal. Good normal." "Thank you for sharing him with me," Jessica replied, understanding that custody arrangements were built on legal frameworks but sustained through emotional generosity that couldn't be mandated by court orders or guaranteed through compliance with visitation schedules. After they left, Jessica, Ryan, and Lily cleaned up with the companionable efficiency of people who'd developed collaborative rhythms through repeated practice. Dishes were washed, leftovers were stored, and the house was restored to order without anyone feeling like cleanup was work rather than the natural conclusion to time well spent with people whose company enhanced rather than drained available emotional energy. "Good dinner," Ryan observed as they finished drying the last serving dish, his assessment carrying the authority of someone who'd attended enough family gatherings to distinguish between obligatory social events and authentic celebrations that created memories worth preserving. "Good practice for tomorrow," Jessica replied, referring to the birthday party that would include not just immediate family, but Ethan's friends from school and neighborhood children whose parents had learned to trust Jessica's ability to supervise large gatherings without creating safety hazards or organizational disasters. Lily had appointed herself final inspection officer, ensuring that no evidence remained of their dinner except positive memories and the satisfied exhaustion that came from spending time with people who'd chosen to include you in their definition of family, despite the absence of biological connections that might have made inclusion automatic rather than intentional. "Same time next week," Ryan asked, referring to their informal standing dinner invitation that had evolved from tentative suggestion to reliable tradition without anyone formally proposing that weekly meals become permanent fixtures in their respective calendars. "Wouldn't miss it," Jessica promised, walking them to the front door through the house that no longer echoed with emptiness, but hummed with the phantom conversations and laughter that would sustain her through whatever challenges the week might bring. As they prepared to leave, Lily hugged Jessica with the unconscious affection that children showed to adults who'd proven themselves safe through consistent behavior rather than dramatic gestures. "See you tomorrow for Ethan's party. I made him a friendship bracelet with his favorite colors, because best friends give each other presents that show they pay attention to what makes people happy." Standing on her front porch, watching Ryan and Lily walk to their car through spring evening air that carried the scent of blooming cherry trees and fresh possibilities, Jessica thought about the transformation that had occurred not just in her house, but in her understanding of what home meant when you shared it with people who'd chosen to love you despite knowing your worst qualities as well as your best intentions. Tomorrow would bring Ethan's 10th birthday party another opportunity to prove herself worthy of the trust he was gradually extending. Another chance to demonstrate that mothers could learn from their mistakes and become better parents through practice and patience rather than perfection and control. Tonight, it was enough to know that when people asked her about family, she could point to photographs on her mantelpiece that included children who weren't biologically related to her, but who called her part of their chosen family anyway. To a man who'd saved her life in more ways than he probably understood to an ex-husband, who'd found happiness with someone who made him laugh in ways Jessica never had. Some stories didn't end with dramatic reconciliation or perfect resolution of all conflicts. The best stories Jessica had learned were the ones that continued evolving through daily choices to show up for each other, to forgive mistakes while working to avoid repeating them, to believe that love multiplied rather than diminished when shared with people who needed it as much as you needed to give it. 3 years after that desperate text sent from Mickey's Tavern Alley, Jessica stood in the auditorium of Ethan's middle school on a crisp October evening, watching her 12-year-old son deliver the opening address for the annual academic achievement celebration with the kind of poise that suggested he'd inherited the best qualities from all the adults who'd contributed to his emotional development through patient consistency rather than dramatic intervention. "Excellence isn't about being perfect," Ethan said into the microphone, his voice carrying across an audience of parents and teachers who'd gathered to acknowledge student accomplishments that reflected dedication rather than natural talent, effort rather than effortless achievement. "Excellence is about showing up every day and trying to be better than you were yesterday, even when yesterday was really hard and being better seems impossible." Jessica sat in the third row between Ryan and Lily, surrounded by David and Sarah, who held their 6-month-old daughter Emma with the competent efficiency of parents who'd learned to navigate public events with infant logistics that required constant attention to feeding schedules and noise management protocols. The baby wore a onesie that proclaimed Big Brother's biggest fan in letters that had been personally selected by Ethan during a shopping expedition where he'd taken his sibling preparation responsibilities seriously enough to research optimal fabric choices for infant comfort during extended family outings. When I was younger, Ethan continued making eye contact with audience members rather than reading directly from prepared notes. My family went through some changes that made everything feel uncertain. My parents got divorced, my mom had to work on being healthy, and I lived with my dad and stepmom while my mom learned how to be the kind of parent I needed her to be. Jessica's breath caught not from shame at having their family history acknowledged publicly, but from pride that her son had developed the emotional intelligence to discuss difficult topics with honesty that helped rather than hurt his audience of peers who might be navigating similar family complications without understanding that survival was possible when adults committed to growth rather than just managing crisis. "But here's what I learned," Ethan said, his voice gaining strength as he reached the heart of his message. "Families aren't just the people you're born with. Families are the people who show up for you when showing up is hard, who help you become better than you thought you could be, who love you not because they have to, but because they choose to." He gestured toward their section of the auditorium, where Jessica sat surrounded by the network of relationships that had grown from Ryan's single act of mercy into an extended community of people who'd learned to support each other through ordinary challenges and extraordinary celebrations with equal dedication. "My family includes my dad and stepmom and new baby sister," Ethan continued, "but it also includes my mum, who worked really hard to become someone I could trust again, and Mr. Ryan, who taught me that kindness is more powerful than revenge, and Lily, who became my sister because we chose each other instead of just accepting what we were given." The audience listened with the kind of attention that suggested these weren't abstract concepts, but practical wisdom delivered by someone young enough to remember learning these lessons and mature enough to articulate their significance for people who might need hope that their own complicated situations could resolve into something beautiful given sufficient time and appropriate effort. "Tonight, we're celebrating academic achievement," Ethan said, approaching his conclusion with the confidence of someone who'd practiced public speaking through family dinner conversations where his opinions were valued rather than dismissed as inadequate due to his age. "But I want to suggest that the most important achievement isn't getting perfect grades or winning competitions. The most important achievement is learning how to love people well, how to forgive mistakes while working not to repeat them, how to build something good from whatever pieces you've been given, even when those pieces seem broken beyond repair." The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, reflecting audience recognition that they'd heard wisdom that transcended typical student achievement ceremony content. Parents wiped tears that spoke to their own experiences of family complexity that had required creative solutions, and patient faith that things could improve when everyone committed to growth rather than just enduring difficulty. As families migrated toward the reception area, where refreshments waited alongside displays of student artwork and science projects that demonstrated intellectual curiosity applied to real-world problems, Jessica found herself surrounded by other parents who approached her with the kind of tentative warmth that suggested they recognized her from local news coverage of the Walsh Family Foundation, but weren't certain about appropriate conversation protocol for meeting someone whose professional success had been achieved after very public personal failure. "Thank you for what your foundation does for families like ours," said Maria Santos, whose husband had benefited from the career transition program after losing his construction job during the economic downturn that had affected blue-collar employment disproportionately compared to white-collar positions that could be performed remotely during pandemic restrictions. "The childcare assistance made it possible for me to complete nursing school while he learned new skills that qualified him for green energy installation work that pays better than his previous employment." These conversations had become familiar over the past 18 months, as the foundation had expanded from local initiative to regional model that other communities were replicating through partnerships with business leaders who understood that social stability required investment in people rather than just infrastructure that served people who could afford to pay market rates for essential services. The foundation succeeds because it addresses systemic problems rather than just managing individual crises. Jessica replied, understanding that her personal recovery story had become inseparable from professional mission, but that vulnerability displayed appropriately could inspire hope rather than just satisfy curiosity about celebrity rehabilitation narratives. "When we provide childcare support and job training and mental health resources, we're investing in family stability that benefits entire communities rather than just helping individuals survive temporary hardship." Lily had appointed herself unofficial foundation ambassador, explaining to anyone who would listen how emergency assistance programs had helped her friend Maya's family remain in their apartment when Maya's father had been hospitalized with complications from diabetes that had made work impossible during the 6 weeks required for treatment and recovery, that insurance covered medically but not financially in terms of lost wages that had threatened housing security. "The foundation isn't charity," Lily said, with the conviction of someone who'd absorbed complex social concepts through observation and family discussion that treated children as capable of understanding adult problems when those problems were explained with appropriate context. "It's investment in people who just need temporary help to solve permanent problems. Like when you loan someone tools to fix their house instead of just giving them money that they'll eventually spend, without learning how to prevent the problem from happening again." Ryan stood near the science fair displays, engaged in conversation with other Mitchell and Harding colleagues whose children attended the same school, discussing marketing strategies that could be applied to non-profit fundraising without compromising mission integrity through commercial partnerships that prioritized profit over program effectiveness. His success at the firm had been accompanied by opportunities to serve on boards and advisory committees where business expertise could be applied to social challenges that required sustainable solutions rather than temporary interventions. The key is demonstrating measurable outcomes that justify continued investment. He was explaining to Tom Mitchell, whose daughter had collaborated with Ethan on a solar energy project that had won regional recognition for innovative application of renewable technology to educational settings that could reduce operational costs while teaching students about environmental responsibility. When donors see that family support services reduce long-term social service costs by addressing problems before they become crises, funding becomes investment rather than expense. As the evening progressed toward natural conclusion, and families began the process of collecting coats and backpacks and the accumulated debris of successful social events, Jessica found herself standing outside the school entrance with Ethan, both of them looking up at stars that seemed particularly bright against October sky that held promise of clear weather, despite Seattle's reputation for perpetual precipitation. "You did really well tonight," she told her son, understanding that his public speaking confidence reflected emotional security that had been rebuilt through 3 years of consistent adult behavior that prioritized his welfare over their own convenience or professional obligations. That was a beautiful speech about family and achievement and what really matters when we measure success. "I learned it from watching all of you," Ethan replied, with the insight that 12-year-olds possessed when they'd been raised by adults who demonstrated values through actions rather than just discussing principles during theoretical conversations that had no practical application. "You and Dad and Sarah and Mr. Ryan and Lily, you all showed me that the best families are the ones where people choose to love each other even when loving is difficult, where mistakes get forgiven but not forgotten, so we can learn from them and do better next time." The drive home took them through neighborhoods that had been transformed by 3 years of economic recovery programs and community development initiatives that had grown from individual family success stories into systematic approaches to addressing poverty and instability that affected children's ability to succeed academically when basic needs weren't consistently met at home. Streetlights illuminated sidewalks where families walked together after evening activities, where children played in parks that had been renovated through public-private partnerships that prioritized community benefit over development profit. "Do you think it's working?" Ethan asked as they passed the community center that housed several foundation programs, its windows glowing with warm light from evening classes where adults learned job skills while their children participated in tutoring sessions that provided academic support without stigmatizing families who needed assistance that more affluent communities took for granted. "What do you mean?" Jessica asked, though she suspected she knew what he was really asking, whether their efforts to address social problems were creating meaningful change, rather than just making privileged people feel better about inequality. They weren't personally responsible for creating, but could help address through resources and influence they'd been fortunate enough to accumulate. "The foundation, the program's all the work you do to help families," Ethan clarified. "Do you think it's actually making things better for people, or are we just treating symptoms instead of solving the real problems that make people need help in the first place?" The question demonstrated the kind of systems thinking that suggested Ethan had inherited analytical capabilities from both parents, along with ethical sensibilities that prioritized effectiveness over good intentions that didn't produce measurable results for people whose lives were affected by social policies rather than just academic theories about optimal intervention strategies. "I think we're doing both," Jessica replied honestly, appreciating that he'd asked directly rather than accepting adult assurances that might be emotionally comforting but intellectually insufficient for someone who understood that good intentions without effective implementation could waste resources that needed to be maximized for optimal impact. "We're helping individual families solve immediate problems, and we're also advocating for policy changes that address systemic issues like affordable childcare and healthcare access and education funding that affects entire communities rather than just people who happen to qualify for specific assistance programs." At home, they found Ryan and Lily in the kitchen, where evidence suggested they'd been conducting experiments in dessert preparation that had resulted in chocolate chip cookies shaped like academic achievement medals, created in honor of the evening's celebration, and Ethan's successful public speaking debut that deserved recognition through edible appreciation that combined artistic expression with caloric reward. "How did we do?" Lily asked, gesturing toward cooling racks that held cookies decorated with icing patterns that approximated medal designs while maintaining the realistic expectations of 9-year-old artistic capabilities applied to sugar decoration techniques that prioritized enthusiasm over precision. "Professional quality," Ethan declared with the authority of someone who'd learned to appreciate effort over outcome, creativity over conformity. Love expressed through homemade gifts rather than purchased items that might look more impressive but carried less emotional significance. As they sat around the kitchen table sharing cookies and conversation about the evening's success and plans for upcoming family activities that would include Halloween costume coordination and Thanksgiving menu planning that accommodated multiple dietary preferences and scheduling constraints, Jessica found herself thinking about the ripple effects that had grown from that single moment when Ryan had chosen mercy over judgment in a rain-soaked alley where she'd learned what helplessness felt like when money couldn't purchase safety. His kindness had created exponential returns, not just for her personal recovery and family reunification, but for the hundreds of families who'd been served by foundation programs that existed because successful people had learned to use their advantages to address disadvantages that affected community stability rather than just individual prosperity. Every child who'd remained in stable housing because of emergency assistance, every parent who'd found sustainable employment through job training programs, every family who'd accessed mental health services before crisis required more expensive intervention represented evidence that grace given freely multiplied rather than diminished when shared with people who needed it. "You know what I realized tonight?" Jessica said, looking around the table at faces illuminated by overhead lighting and the kind of contentment that couldn't be purchased but had to be cultivated through daily choices to prioritize relationships over individual achievement, community welfare over personal advancement. "What's that?" Ryan asked, though his expression suggested he already understood the answer. "I realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is help someone else stand up when they've fallen down," Jessica replied, watching Lily and Ethan negotiate cookie distribution according to principles of fairness that prioritized equal treatment over individual preference, sharing that created abundance rather than scarcity. Because saving someone else is often exactly how you save yourself. The words hung in the kitchen air like benediction over people who'd learned that families could be built from broken pieces that mercy offered. Freely created more mercy rather than depleting available supplies that grace received. Gratefully generated grace that could be extended to others, who needed reminder that their stories weren't over. That redemption was possible when people committed to growth rather than just survival. That the most beautiful beginnings often started with someone choosing compassion over convenience. When compassion required sacrifice that logic couldn't justify, but love demanded anyway. Outside October, rain had begun the kind of gentle precipitation that nourished whatever had been planted with hope and tended with patience, washing the city clean for tomorrow's opportunities to choose kindness over indifference, inclusion over isolation, love over fear in the ongoing human experiment of learning to live together despite all the reasons they could find to live apart. Somewhere in that rain, other broken people were making choices that would either lead them toward healing or keep them trapped in cycles of pain that hurt not just themselves, but everyone whose lives intersected with theirs in ways that could generate more love or more isolation, depending on whether they chose mercy or judgment when mercy felt impossible, but judgment felt insufficient for the complexity of human relationships that required forgiveness to flourish. The light we choose to share. Jessica thought, looking around her kitchen at people who'd become family through choice rather than genetics, multiplies rather than diminishes. It creates ripples that reach places we'll never see, touches lives we'll never know about, generates hope in people who might otherwise surrender to despair, because they haven't learned yet that broken things can become beautiful when tended with patience and faith, and the kind of love that shows up consistently, rather than dramatically daily, rather than occasionally through ordinary gestures, rather than grand romantic speeches that sound impressive, but fade when tested by time and ordinary human limitations. Sometimes the most important stories weren't the ones that ended with perfect resolution, but the ones that continued evolving through accumulated choice. to keep showing up for each other, to keep believing in second chances and third chances, and however many chances were required for people to learn how to love well, how to forgive completely, how to build something good from whatever materials they'd been given. Even when those materials seemed insufficient for the magnificence they hoped to create together. Ryan's choice to save her in the rain had proven that mercy was more powerful than justice, that kindness was more transformative than revenge. That grace given freely was the most potent force for change that humans had discovered in their long history of learning to live together. That single act of unexpected compassion had generated more love rather than less, had created family rather than destroying it, had demonstrated that sometimes the most heroic thing you could do was simply refuse to drive past someone else's emergency, because helping was what good people did when helping cost them everything and gave them nothing except the knowledge that they'd chosen to be better than their circumstances demanded. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that grace is more powerful than grudges, that broken people can build beautiful families, and that mercy offered freely creates more mercy rather than less, then please take a moment to share it. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances. Subscribe to our channel if you want more stories that prove love really does multiply when we choose compassion over convenience. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that their worst moment doesn't define their worth, that redemption is possible, and that sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is help someone else when they least deserve it, but most need it. Because in a world that often feels divided, stories like these remind us that the light we choose to share with others creates more light, not less. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful reminders that hope is never wasted, that families are built through choice as much as chance, and that mercy given freely is the most beautiful thing humans can offer each other.